Welcome back to History Teller YT, the channel where the past comes alive and forgotten stories are brought back to life with every word. Today, we journey into one of the most pivotal events in English history, the Norman Conquest of 1066, a story of ambition, betrayal, epic battles, and the birth of a new England that would change the course of history forever. In the next 2 hours, we will follow the thrilling rise of William the Conqueror, the desperate last stand of Harold Godwinson, and the Battle of Hastings, a clash that would reshape a kingdom. We'll explore not just the battles, but the strategies, the politics, the culture, and the lives of ordinary people caught in this seismic change. From the initial invasion, through the establishment of Norman rule, to the devastating harrying of the North, and the creation of the Doomsday Book, this is a story of conquest, survival, and transformation. So, if you've ever wondered how England transformed from Anglo-Saxon traditions to Norman rule, how castles, law, language, and even the church were reshaped, then make sure you're ready. Grab your listening ears, because this is History Teller YT, and today, the story of a Norman conquest will unfold in a way you've never heard before. Stay with us, because every segment of this history is alive with intrigue, courage, and consequence. Before the Norman conquest reshaped England forever, the island was already a place full of tension, ambition, and fragile alliances. Anglo-Saxon England in the mid-11th century was outwardly peaceful, but internally unstable. The kingdom had grown wealthy through trade, farming, and its expanding role in European politics. Towns like Winchester, York, and London buzzed with merchants, smiths, and travelers carrying goods from Scandinavia, Francia, and distant Mediterranean ports. Yet under the surface, England was a kingdom built on uneasy compromises. The long reign of King Edward the Confessor brought a sense of calm, but he left behind a dangerous problem. No clear heir, and many powerful men believed they had a legitimate claim to the throne. Edward himself was deeply religious, even distant, more comfortable in the monastery than on the battlefield. His court was divided between factions: the powerful Godwin family, who controlled much of southern England, and the Norman advisors Edward had brought with him after spending many years in Normandy. This mix created bitterness and suspicion that would later explode into open conflict. Ordinary people at this time lived simple lives in wooden houses with thatched roofs. Villages were surrounded by fields farmed using age-old methods. Most people rarely traveled far from home, and kingship felt like a distant authority, except when taxes were collected or soldiers recruited. Still, they took pride in their identity as English, a culture shaped by centuries of poetry, lawmaking, and warfare against Vikings. The great epic Beowulf was part of this tradition, celebrating bravery, loyalty, and strength. Despite this stability, England had enemies on all sides. To the north, the Vikings of Norway looked south with hungry eyes. To the south and across the Channel, ambitious leaders watched England's prosperity with envy. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in the kingdom, waited for the moment that would determine the fate of his entire nation. The stage was set for dramatic events that would shake Europe and forever change history. Across the English Channel, another world was growing in strength: the Duchy of Normandy. Founded by Viking settlers only a century earlier, Normandy had evolved into a military powerhouse with a disciplined cavalry, stone castles, and a ruling class hungry for expansion. Its people were neither fully Viking nor fully French. They were a fierce blend of both cultures, skilled with the sword and loyal to their leaders. At the center of this rising power was William, born in 1028 as the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy and a tanner's daughter named Herleva. Because of this, many Norman nobles initially refused to accept him. William became Duke as a child, and his early years were filled with assassination attempts, rebellions, and betrayal. Knights and rivals plotted constantly to overthrow him. But instead of being crushed, William grew harder, sharper, and more determined. By the time he reached adulthood, he had become one of the strongest rulers in Europe. He rewarded loyalty with land and punished treason with unforgiving force. Under his leadership, Normandy expanded its military might and developed a reputation for efficiency and discipline. Their cavalry was feared everywhere, trained to break enemy lines with brutal force. Norman knights rode heavy horses, wore chainmail armor, and used a combination of lances and swords that allowed them to dominate open battlefield combat. William also had strong diplomatic connections. He married Matilda of Flanders, strengthening ties across northern Europe and giving him legitimacy in the eyes of kings and popes. When Edward the Confessor of England welcomed Norman influence into his court, William believed he saw a pathway to something greater, the English crown itself. He claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and whether this promise was real or imagined, William intended to enforce it. The destiny of two nations was now entwined, and the world was moving toward a clash unlike anything England had seen before. When King Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, England erupted into a crisis that changed the course of history. Three powerful men believed they had the right to rule. The first was Harold Godwinson, the most respected English noble, chosen by the Witan, the Council of Elders. Harold claimed that Edward had named him successor on his deathbed, and the nobles supported him because he was strong, capable, and present in England. But not everyone agreed. In the north, Harold Hardrada, king of Norway and one of the last great Viking warriors, believed England belonged to him through an old treaty involving previous kings. Hardrada was a legend, a giant of a man and a battle-hardened fighter whose adventures stretched from Scandinavia to Constantinople. He saw Edward's death as the perfect chance to reclaim lands he believed were rightfully his. Yet the most ambitious claimant of all was William of Normandy. William argued that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold had sworn an oath to support his claim. When Harold accepted the crown, William saw it as a betrayal that demanded vengeance. The Pope himself later blessed William's campaign, giving him a holy banner and turning his invasion into something more than a political struggle. It became a sacred mission. As these powerful leaders prepared for war, the people of England braced themselves. They did not yet know the scale of the storm that was coming. Armies would march from opposite ends of Europe. Blood would cover the hills of Yorkshire and Sussex. And before the year ended, the English way of life, its rulers, its language, its culture, would be changed forever. When King Edward the Confessor died on January 5th, 1066, England woke to a new reality. The throne, once held by a quiet and pious king, was suddenly the center of a fierce political storm. The Witan, England's council of nobles and church leaders, gathered quickly in London. They needed a ruler who could command loyalty, hold the kingdom together, and defend it against foreign threats. Their choice fell on Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful man in England and the natural protector of the realm. Harold was not a king by blood, but he was a king by strength, experience, and respect. He had spent years defending England from Viking raids, managing disputes among nobles, and keeping peace across the shires. The people trusted him, Even the warriors who guarded the borders admired his courage. So, when the Witan chose him as king, many believed he was the only man capable of protecting the kingdom from the chaos that Edward's death might bring. Still, Harold's position was fragile from the moment he placed the crown upon his head. He knew his enemies would not stay quiet. William of Normandy would see this as a provocation, perhaps even a betrayal. Harold Hardrada of Norway would see an opportunity to press an old claim. The kings of Scotland and Denmark were watching closely as well. England, wealthy and unprotected, was like a ripe orchard waiting to be plucked by ambitious hands. Harold also faced challenges inside his own kingdom. Some nobles in the north believed the powerful Godwin family had too much control. Others feared that Harold's rapid rise would disrupt the balance of power. Yet Harold tried to build unity. He traveled across England in the early months of 1066, meeting local leaders, gathering oaths of loyalty, and raising troops for the threats he knew were coming. He placed his brothers Gyrth and Leofwine in charge of key regions, creating a family network strong enough to respond to war. But even with all his efforts, the new king was haunted by the knowledge that forces were gathering across the sea. William was preparing a fleet. Hardrada was forging alliances. And Harold understood something few others did. That 1066 would not be a year of peace. It would be a year of reckoning, and only one ruler would survive to claim England's future, while Harold worked to strengthen England. William of Normandy focused on building an invasion force unlike anything Europe had seen in decades. William was not a man of hesitation. The moment he heard Harold had taken the English crown, he immediately declared it an insult to his honor and a violation of the promises Edward had allegedly made to him. But William also knew this was more than a matter of pride. It was his chance to reshape history. Normandy buzzed with activity as William summoned his vassals, knights, and barons. He called for ships, soldiers, and supplies from across his duchy. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging swords, helmets, and chainmail armor. Carpenters built sturdy transports to carry horses across the channel. Even farmers were ordered to produce surplus grain so the army could be fed during the campaign. Every corner of Normandy felt the weight of William's ambition. But William needed more than Norman support. He needed allies from across Europe to legitimize his claim. So he turned to the Pope. William argued that Harold had broken a sacred oath, an oath sworn on holy relics, and therefore Harold's kingship was sinful. Whether every detail was true or not mattered little. What mattered was the Pope's response. After careful consideration, the Pope granted William his blessing and even sent a holy banner, a sign that his invasion was backed by God. This changed everything. Suddenly, knights from Flanders, Brittany, and northern France flocked to William's banner. They were promised land in rich, prosperous England if victory came, and these men were hungry for wealth and glory. William's camp grew into a vast military machine. Reports from that time describe rows of tents stretching across the coastline, the clatter of armored riders training on horseback, and the constant sound of work as shipbuilders hammered together the vessels that would carry the army into battle. William, ever cautious, waited for the perfect conditions. The winds had to be right. The timing had to be precise. He knew Harold would not sit idle forever, but William believed fate favored him. He believed his claim was just. And, above all, he believed his iron would shape the destiny of nations. As summer turned into autumn, his fleet waited like a giant poised to strike, and England, across the water, braced for the storm it could feel but could not yet see. While Harold and William prepared for their showdown, a third force entered the contest. the fierce and legendary Viking king, Harold Hardrada of Norway. In the northern world, Hardrada was already a hero. He had fought in distant lands, served as a commander in the Byzantine Empire, and gathered wealth beyond imagination. His name meant hard ruler, and it fit him well. Hardrada was relentless, fearless, and respected by warriors across Scandinavia. His claim to the English throne came from an ancient treaty between previous kings. Even though many believed the claim was outdated, Hardrada refused to let it fade. When he learned of Edward's death and Harold's coronation, he saw his chance. The old warrior, now in his early 50s, gathered a massive fleet and prepared to sail across the North Sea. He was joined by Godwin's son, Harold's exiled brother, who hated Harold and wanted revenge. With Tostig guiding him, Hardrada gained not just a political partner, but also valuable knowledge about England's defenses. Their combined forces were terrifying. Ships filled with heavily armed Vikings stretched across the horizon. These were hardened fighters, men who had raided coasts and battled in icy seas since childhood. They carried spears, axes, and round shields painted with bold patterns. Songs were sung, drums were beaten, and war banners rose above the decks. For these warriors, the invasion of England was not just a campaign. It was a chance to carve their names into the great sagas. When Hardrada's fleet approached northern England in September 1066, villages along the coast saw the sky darken with sails. Panic spread quickly. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, tried to form a defense, but Hardrada crushed them at the Battle of Fulford, proving he was still a master of war. With victory won, he marched toward York, confident that England would soon fall into his hands. But the old Viking king did not know what awaited him. Harold Godwinson, hearing of the attack, made one of the fastest forced marches in medieval history, nearly 200 miles in just a few days. He was determined to protect his kingdom at any cost. And so, two great armies moved toward each other, bound by fate, ready to clash on a quiet meadow by the River Derwent. The world was about to witness a brutal battle that would mark the beginning of the end for the Viking Age. The news of the Viking invasion struck Harold Godwinson like a thunderclap. He had spent months preparing for William of Normandy, keeping a massive army stationed along the southern coast. But now everything changed. Harold Hardrada, the mighty Viking king, had landed in the north with hundreds of ships. He had already defeated the northern earls at Fulford. York, one of England's most important cities, was on the edge of surrender. Harold knew he couldn't afford to wait. If Hardrada secured the north, he would gain reinforcements, supplies, and loyal allies. Worse, Harold's own brother Tostig was with the Vikings, offering inside knowledge of English defenses. The situation was more dangerous than anyone had expected. Leaving Normandy unchecked was risky, but losing the north was fatal. So Harold made a decision that revealed the full force of his leadership. He ordered his elite army, the Housecarls, along with local fighters, to march immediately toward York. What followed was one of the most remarkable marches in medieval history. Harold's men covered nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, moving with a speed that stunned even their enemies. The army pushed through forests, waded across rivers, and slept in fields under the open sky. They were exhausted. Their armor bruised their shoulders, and their boots tore at their feet, yet their determination never wavered. They marched with the knowledge that every step brought them closer to saving their homeland. Harold understood morale was the key to victory. He spoke to his troops often, reminding them that they were fighting not just for a crown, but for the safety of their families, their farms, and the land they had inherited from generations of English ancestors. His words strengthened them. Some soldiers said that during this march, Harold walked among them as an equal, not as a distant king, sharing food and encouraging those who struggled to keep pace. Meanwhile, the Vikings celebrated, believing England's king was far away. Hardrada expected no resistance for several days. His army relaxed, confident they had already broken English power in the north. But Harold Godwinson was closer than they imagined, racing across the countryside with an army fueled by urgency and resolve. As the English forces approached York, scouts reported Viking positions near a place called Stamford Bridge. Harold smiled, knowing the element of surprise would now be his greatest weapon. The stage was set for a clash that would echo across history, a battle that would end an age and reshape the destiny of England forever. On the morning of September 25th, 1066, the Vikings were resting at Stamford Bridge, believing they had several days to recover before any English army could reach them. Many had even left their armor behind at their longship camp miles away. It was warm for an English autumn, and Viking warriors lounged comfortably, unaware that danger was already approaching. Suddenly, dust rose on the horizon. At first, the Vikings assumed it was local farmers or traders, but as the shapes became clearer, terror spread among them. Lines of English soldiers, shields glinting, were marching straight onto the field. Harold Godwinson had arrived far earlier than anyone believed possible. The shock was overwhelming. Hardrada scrambled to prepare his men. Messengers ran shouting orders, and warriors grabbed their weapons, though many had no time to retrieve their armor. Still, these were Vikings, fierce, proud, and unafraid. They formed a defensive shield wall, determined to hold their position. The English wasted no time. Harold's army, fueled by anger and exhaustion, charged with deadly precision. The first impact of the shield walls echoed like thunder. Spears shattered, axes clanged against shields, and the ground shook under the weight of the struggle. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and close. Men grappled hand to hand, slipping in the mud and blood, swinging weapons with desperate force. One of the most legendary moments of the battle occurred on the narrow bridge itself. A single giant Viking warrior stood blocking the crossing, holding back the entire English advance with a massive axe. No one could reach him. He cut down man after man, refusing to back away. Harold's soldiers grew frustrated. Then, according to old accounts, a clever English soldier slid underneath the bridge in a small boat and thrust a spear upward into the Viking's body. With the defender gone, the English stormed across. Hardrada, towering and fearless, fought at the front lines like a warrior from legend. But fate caught him. An arrow struck him in the throat, ending the life of one of the last great Viking kings in an instant. With their leader dead, the Viking line faltered. Tostig took command and continued the fight, but he too fell, cutting the last tie between Viking ambition and the English throne. By the end of the day, the battlefield was covered with fallen warriors. Of the hundreds of Viking ships that had arrived, only a small number were needed to carry the survivors home. The Viking Age, a period that had shaped Europe for nearly 3 centuries, effectively ended on that field. Harold had won a stunning and heroic victory, but he paid a price. His army was battered, exhausted, and weakened. As he celebrated at York, he received news that chilled his heart. William of Normandy had landed in the south. The next battle would decide the fate of England itself. The victory at Stamford Bridge was one of the greatest achievements in Harold Godwinson's life. He had defeated a legendary Viking king, crushed a dangerous rebellion led by his own brother, and saved the northern part of England from falling into foreign control. The people of York welcomed Harold as a hero, offering gifts, pledges of loyalty and celebrations in his honor. But beneath the celebration, Harold felt the weight of fear. His army had marched for days, fought a massive battle, and suffered many casualties. His housecarls, his best-trained elite warriors, had fought savagely, but their numbers were now reduced. Many local fighters had gone home after the victory, believing the crisis was over. Harold knew better. He knew this was only the beginning. He tried to rest his men and reorganize his forces. Yet messages arrived that changed everything. One messenger raced into York, breathless, delivering devastating news. William the Conqueror had landed at Pevensey Bay with thousands of troops and hundreds of ships. Villages were already burning. Norman cavalry patrolled the countryside. William had come prepared with horses, engineers, archers, and supplies. A full invasion force ready for a long campaign. Harold's face hardened. He had no choice but to march south immediately, even though his men were exhausted from the brutal fighting in the north. Some advised him to wait, gather a new army, and face William later with fresh troops. But Harold feared delay would allow William to entrench himself. The Normans would fortify their position, gain support from local lords, and ravage southern England before Harold could respond. So once again, Harold pushed his army into a forced march. They headed south along rough roads, crossing forests, hills, and rivers. This second march, coming so soon after Stamford Bridge, pushed the soldiers to their limits. Some collapsed from fatigue. Others fought through pain, driven by loyalty to their king. As they traveled, Harold sent word across the land, calling men from every shire to join him. But time was against him. William, disciplined and calculating, had already begun preparing for battle. His cavalry trained daily on the open fields near Hastings. His engineers built defenses. His archers practiced volleys that could rain death from a distance. William was not merely waiting. He was shaping the battlefield to his advantage. By the time Harold reached the south, his men were tired but determined. They positioned themselves on a long ridge called Senlac Hill, choosing a strong defensive position. Harold believed he could hold the high ground and force William to attack uphill, where the English shield wall would be nearly impossible to break. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles in medieval history, a clash that would determine the ruler of England and alter the culture, language, and identity of the nation for centuries. When William of Normandy finally received the winds he needed, his fleet set sail across the English Channel like a vast floating army of determination and ambition. The long-awaited moment had come. Harold Godwinson was still celebrating his victory at Stamford Bridge, unaware that the most dangerous enemy of all was already approaching England's southern shores. William's ships, more than 700, cut through the water, carrying knights in chain mail, archers with longbows, engineers, carpenters, horses, and supplies for a full-scale conquest. As dawn broke on September 28th, 1066, the Norman fleet arrived at Pevensey Bay. William stepped onto English soil with confidence, believing fate and God were both on his side. For weeks he had waited impatiently for the weather to shift, watching the horizon, knowing that Harold might attack at any moment if he discovered the invasion early. But now, against all odds, the sea had opened the door and escorted William straight into England. The landing was swift and mostly unchallenged. The English forces that had spent the summer guarding the southern coast had disbanded in early September due to lack of supplies. Peasants returned to their farms, soldiers went home, and local lords assumed the danger had passed. William's sudden arrival caught everyone by surprise. His troops unloaded horses, wagons, weapons, and heavy timber frames for building fortifications. Norman efficiency was on full display. Every man knew his task, and every action moved the army closer to readiness. Within hours, William ordered the construction of a temporary wooden fort inside the old Roman walls of Pevensey. This gave his army a secure foothold in case Harold arrived early. The fortifications rose quickly, with carpenters using pre-cut wooden beams carried on the ships. These portable castle components showed just how prepared William had been for this invasion. It was not a raid. It was a planned takeover of an entire kingdom. Once Pevensey was secure, William moved toward Hastings and built a second modern Bailey fort. From here, he sent riders into the surrounding countryside to gather supplies and intimidate the local population. Villages were raided, food was seized, and farms were burned. This served two purposes: to feed the army and to provoke Harold into marching south faster than he should. William knew Harold's greatest weakness: his fierce desire to defend England at all costs. If Harold rushed into battle, weakened and exhausted from the northern campaign, William could defeat him. The Normans were now firmly established on English soil. William had achieved the first major step of his conquest. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead. The English king, hardened by war and driven by desperation, was already marching toward him. The confrontation that would shape the future of England was coming closer with every hour. After securing Pevensey, William quickly recognized that a stronger base of operations was necessary. He moved eastward and established his primary camp near Hastings, a strategic location with access to the coast, forests, and open hills suitable for cavalry maneuvers. Hastings was not just a campsite. It became a fortress, a supply hub, and the beating heart of William's invasion strategy. In a matter of days, Norman engineers transformed the hillside into a formidable defensive site. They constructed a large motte and bailey castle, using timber transported directly from Normandy. The motte, a raised earthen mound, supported a wooden tower from which William could observe the landscape and coordinate his army. The bailey, an enclosed courtyard, served as storage for weapons, food, horses, and tents. Surrounded by a ditch and wooden palisade, the fort was nearly impossible to take without heavy siege equipment, something Harold did not have. Norman scouts swept across the region, mapping the terrain and identifying key locations. They raided farms, seized livestock, and cut down trees to clear the land. The local population panicked, fleeing into the forests or surrendering in hopes of mercy. William's men left a trail of destruction, but this brutality served a strategic purpose. It painted William as an unstoppable force, and it pressured Harold to act immediately rather than rebuild a stronger army. Life in the Norman camp was busy and disciplined. Knights practiced charges on horseback, learning how to maneuver with precision. Archers trained their volleys, adjusting for the unpredictable English wind. Infantry drilled in tight formations, preparing for hand-to-hand combat. Smiths repaired armor, sharpened weapons, and reinforced shields. Priests blessed the soldiers daily, reminding them that the Pope had endorsed their mission, making their conquest a holy cause. William himself maintained a calm but relentless schedule. He held councils with his commanders, reviewed troop numbers, inspected fortifications, and personally approved scouting missions. His leadership style combined fear and loyalty. Nobles obeyed him because he was strong, decisive, and willing to punish betrayal without hesitation. Meanwhile, the Normans gathered intelligence about Harold's movements. They learned that he had defeated the Vikings and was marching south at incredible speed. William sensed the opportunity he had hoped for. Harold's army would arrive exhausted, reduced in number and desperate to stop further Norman destruction. Every day William remained in Hastings tightened the trap he was setting. The stage was almost ready. William waited patiently, knowing that the next battle would determine whether he became a conqueror or a defeated pretender. The quiet moment before the storm was ending. Soon, the destiny of England would be decided on a bloody hillside. While William strengthened his position at Hastings, Harold Godwinson began the second grueling march of the year. Only days earlier, he had fought and won at Stamford Bridge, one of the hardest battles of his life. His army was exhausted, bloodied, and drastically reduced in numbers. Many survivors were suffering from wounds, fatigue, and dehydration. Despite this, Harold knew he had no choice. The Normans were burning English soil, and every hour they remained unchallenged weakened Harold's authority and terrified his people. Harold gathered the men who were still able to fight. His loyal housecarls, though exhausted, stayed firmly by his side. These elite warriors were the backbone of the English army, massive men with double-handed axes, iron discipline, and unwavering loyalty. But their numbers were far less than before. Many had fallen fighting the Vikings. Others simply had no strength left after marching hundreds of miles. Harold also called upon the FYRD, the local militia made up of farmers and villagers. These men responded with bravery, leaving their homes to defend their king. But they lacked the training and discipline of professional soldiers. Still, their presence swelled the army's size as it marched south along ancient roads through forests and plains. Every man who joined increased Harold's hope, but he knew the quality of his army was not what it had been just weeks before. The march toward London was filled with tension. Harold tried to rest his troops, but time worked against him. Reports of Norman raids reached him daily: burned homes, stolen cattle, dead villagers. Each message made Harold's blood boil. His instinct was always to protect the English people, and he refused to allow William more time to destroy the countryside. In London, Harold briefly paused to gather more troops and speak with advisors. Some urged caution. They warned him not to rush in a battle, to wait for reinforcements from Mercia and Northumbria. They argued that Harold's forces needed time to recover. But Harold's sense of duty was stronger than his desire for safety. He knew the people expected him to act immediately. He also believed that if he allowed William to strengthen his position further, the Normans would become too difficult to remove. So Harold continued marching toward Hastings. As the army progressed south, morale fluctuated between determination and fear. Many soldiers spoke of their love for their king, but they also whispered about William's fearsome cavalry and the Pope's blessing on the Norman invasion. Rumors spread quickly, creating uncertainty in the ranks. Finally, on the night of October 13th, Harold and his army arrived near a ridge later known as Senlac Hill. Harold positioned his men at the top, forming a massive shield wall, a traditional English defensive strategy that had defeated Vikings countless times. The English prepared for the battle that would decide the fate of their kingdom. Harold looked across the darkness toward the Norman camp. He knew that tomorrow he would face William in a battle that would shape the destiny of England for centuries. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. Victory meant saving his people. Defeat meant the end of Anglo-Saxon rule forever. The night was quiet, but the air was thick with fear and anticipation. The greatest battle of Harold's life, and one of the greatest in English history, was only hours away. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hastings, the battlefield itself stood as a chilling reminder of how violently England's fate had been rewritten. Thousands of Anglo-Saxon corpses lay scattered across the meadows, mixed with Norman, Breton, and Flemish soldiers who had fallen while charging up the hill for what felt like hours. William the Conqueror understood perfectly that even though he had achieved one of the most decisive victories in medieval European history, the conquest of England was far from complete. The English nobility was still alive, the royal treasury was untouched in London, and the support of the church in England was still uncertain. Rather than charging recklessly toward London immediately after the battle, William paused near Hastings to consolidate his victory and to plan his larger strategy with careful precision. William's first concern was to stabilize the region. He allowed his men to rest, regroup, and reinforce their camp with defensive structures. His engineers, known throughout Europe for their ability to build fortifications with incredible speed, immediately began constructing a temporary modern bailey fort. This not only helped maintain control over the surrounding land, but also sent a powerful message to the Anglo-Saxon survivors. The Normans were not merely invaders. They intended to rule. While the bodies were being buried or burned, and while priests held masses for the souls of the fallen, William held councils with his most trusted commanders. Each meeting focused on the same core questions. How strong was London's remaining defensive force? How would the surviving English nobles react? And how could William ensure that reinforcements from Normandy continued to arrive safely? Meanwhile, the political situation in London was growing increasingly complicated. When King Harold's death became known, panic spread among the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Some wanted to negotiate with William, others wanted to retreat north to rally more troops, and a final group wanted to crown a new king immediately in the hope of presenting a united front. Eventually, a teenage boy, Edgar Atheling, the last male descendant of the ancient house of Wessex, was proclaimed king, though he lacked experience, military strength, or widespread support. William learned of this attempted coronation within days, and rather than being intimidated, he saw it as an opportunity. A divided London meant a weakened England, and a weakened England meant a much easier conquest. By choosing to pause rather than push forward blindly, William demonstrated his greatest strength, strategic patience. He was not a reckless warlord seeking glory. He was a calculated ruler determined to reshape an entire kingdom. And as his troops prepared to advance again, the landscape of southeastern England waited nervously, knowing that the Norman tide was far from finished. When William finally resumed his march toward London, he advanced with a tactic that combined brute force with psychological warfare. Instead of heading directly north toward the heavily fortified capital, he chose to move east and then north in a sweeping curve, deliberately targeting towns and villages crucial for food, supplies, and morale. His army cut through the English countryside like a fiery blade, burning homes, seizing livestock, and dismantling any possibility of organized resistance. This was not mere cruelty. It was a calculated strategy designed to weaken London's ability to withstand a siege and to terrify the surrounding regions into submission long before William even reached the city gates. The path of destruction worked exactly as William intended. Anglo-Saxon militias, hastily assembled and poorly commanded after Harold's death, attempted to stop him at several small river crossings. Each attempt failed, often within minutes. The Norman cavalry, disciplined and heavily armored, smashed through the uncoordinated defenses with ease. Norman archers, positioned on elevated terrain or behind wooden shields, rained precise volleys of arrows that broke the morale of the English lines even before swords clashed. Survivors fled to London, spreading stories of unstoppable cavalry and devastating fire raids. Within weeks, Much of southern England believed that resisting William was pointless. But not every encounter was violent. In several towns, the local leaders surrendered immediately, offering hostages and oaths of loyalty in exchange for protection. William accepted these surrenders when useful, understanding that each peaceful submission saved lives, preserved food supplies, and allowed him to maintain momentum toward London without exhausting his troops. One by one, key towns along the Thames and around the capital bent the knee, often influenced more by fear than loyalty. William rewarded these early supporters with promises of safety, but everyone knew that disobedience later would mean swift destruction. By late November, William reached the outskirts of London, where he encountered the strongest resistance since Hastings. English forces launched a bold attack on a Norman scouting party near Southwark, attempting to burn the Normans before they established another base. Although the English fought fiercely, William's army once again prevailed, pushing them back toward the city. But rather than besieging London immediately, a costly and dangerous move, William executed yet another strategic twist. He turned west, crossed the Thames at Wallingford, and approached London from the north, cutting off supply lines and isolating the city. This maneuver forced the English nobles into a corner. Either they resisted and starved, or they accepted the inevitable and negotiated. William's advance toward London was not just a military campaign. It was a psychological transformation of England. Town by town, village by village, he demonstrated an inescapable truth. The age of Anglo-Saxon dominance was ending, and the world of Norman rule was rising in its place. As William tightened his grip around London, the city's political leadership found itself more isolated and more uncertain than at any other moment in its history. The English nobles had hoped that simply naming Edgar Atheling as king would unite the kingdom and intimidate William into negotiating from a position of weakness. But reality shifted against them with every passing day. Reports of Norman victories, scorched farmlands, and destroyed villages poured into the city from all directions. Merchants arriving at London's markets confirmed that William's forces were growing stronger, not weaker. Food prices soared, morale fell, and the once mighty capital began to fear what a full Norman siege would look like. Inside the city walls, the debates grew desperate. Some nobles insisted on defending London to the last breath, believing that dying for their homeland was more honorable than submitting to a foreign conqueror. Others argued that William had already proven his military superiority and that further resistance would only lead to destruction. The Archbishop of York, Ealdred, played a significant role in shifting opinions. He warned that God's judgment seemed to favor William, pointing to the Norman victory at Hastings and the rapid fall of English strongholds. Meanwhile, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, found his authority under question because his appointment was controversial even before the conquest, making him unable to negotiate effectively. By early December, fear and pragmatism outweighed pride. A delegation of English nobles, including Edgar Atheling himself, traveled out of London under a flag of truce to meet William at Berkhamsted. There, they submitted formally, offering oaths of loyalty in exchange for William's promise to protect the city and the kingdom. William accepted their submission with the calm confidence of a ruler who already knew the outcome. He treated Edgar Atheling with unexpected respect, recognizing the boy's royal blood even as he removed every remaining possibility of Edgar becoming king. With London's submission secure, William moved into the city in triumph. Norman troops marched behind him, displaying discipline instead of brutality, signaling that the conquest was not merely destruction, but the beginning of a new order. On Christmas Day, 1066, William entered Westminster Abbey for one of the most significant coronations in medieval Europe. As he knelt before the altar and took his oath, he swore to rule England justly, protect the church, and uphold its laws. But outside the abbey, Norman guards misinterpreted the English crowd's celebratory shouts as signs of rebellion. Panicked, they set fire to nearby houses, causing chaos even while the ceremony continued inside. Despite the confusion, the coronation was completed. William of Normandy became William the First, King of England, and the transformation of the kingdom entered a new phase, one that would reshape its society, its language, its architecture, and its future for centuries. When William entered London as the newly crowned King of England, his first months of rule were shaped by one overriding goal: turning military victory into permanent authority. He understood that conquering a kingdom on the battlefield was only half the task. The much harder part was ensuring that the conquered people accepted his rule, obeyed his laws, and recognized his legitimacy. William knew that England was still dangerous. The Anglo-Saxon nobility had not been wiped out. They were simply leaderless and in shock. If they found a way to unite, they could challenge him again. So William needed to act quickly, decisively, and strategically to secure every corner of his new realm. One of his earliest decisions was the construction of castles across England, structures that had barely existed under Anglo-Saxon rule. These castles, built using the Norman Motte and Bailey design, served as military bases, administrative centers, and psychological weapons. The Tower of London, which began as a simple wooden fortification shortly after William's coronation, symbolized Norman dominance in the very heart of the capital. It towered over the city, reminding every Londoner that resistance was not only useless but suicidal. Similar fortifications sprang up in Winchester, Canterbury, Hereford, and other key locations. With each castle built, William placed loyal Norman knights as sheriffs or governors, ensuring that local populations could never again rise without immediate retaliation. At the same time, William took great care to portray himself as the rightful king, not an invader, but the selected heir. He emphasized that King Edward the Confessor had supposedly promised him the throne. He insisted that Harold had broken an oath by seizing power. Whether these claims were entirely true mattered less than the fact that they provided a legal and moral justification for his rule. William worked closely with the church, understanding that religious support was essential for maintaining authority. He met with bishops, replaced corrupt or rebellious churchmen, and promoted clergy loyal to him. By doing so, he positioned himself as both a protector of Christianity and a champion of moral order. To prevent rebellion, William also required oaths of loyalty from surviving Anglo-Saxon leaders. Many nobles traveled to London to place their hands between his and swear allegiance. William accepted these oaths, but watched them closely. He rewarded cooperation with land, privileges, and protection. Disloyalty was punished swiftly and harshly. The message was clear. William would rule England with justice when possible, but with force whenever necessary. In these first months, William's strategy was a mix of fear, respect, diplomacy, and overwhelming strength. He wanted England to understand that although it had lost its Anglo-Saxon king, it had gained a ruler of immense capability, a man determined to reshape the kingdom forever. After securing his early position in London and other major towns, William turned to an issue that would fundamentally transform the structure of English society: the redistribution of land. Conquest was not simply about victory, it was about reward. The Norman knights, soldiers, and nobles who had risked their lives crossing the English Channel expected to be compensated. They had followed William not just because they admired him, but because they believed that serving him would lead to wealth, honor, and new opportunities. William, who relied heavily on their loyalty, understood that he could never rule England alone. So he created an entirely new feudal system, transferring enormous portions of English land from Anglo-Saxon nobles to Norman lords. This redistribution was not spontaneous or chaotic. It was systematic, controlled, and intentionally designed to weaken the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. Under William's orders, large estates belonging to nobles who had fought with Harold or who resisted after the conquest were confiscated. Sometimes entire families lost everything overnight. The lands were divided into smaller segments and granted to Norman lords who pledged their loyalty directly to William. These new barons became the backbone of Norman authority in England. They built castles, enforced the king's laws, collected taxes, and provided troops whenever William demanded military service. But William was careful not to give too much power to any single lord. Unlike some medieval kings who created vast territories that turned into semi-independent states, William distributed lands in a scattered pattern. A single baron might control a few manors in Yorkshire, several farms in East Anglia, and a castle near the Welsh border, all distant from each other. This prevented any noble from building a power base strong enough to challenge the king. It also ensured that loyalty flowed upward, directly toward William, rather than horizontally between barons. For the ordinary English population, however, life changed dramatically. Many who had worked under Anglo-Saxon lords now found themselves answering to foreign masters who spoke a different language, demanded higher taxes, and imposed unfamiliar laws. Norman officials enforced strict discipline, ensuring that peasants fulfilled their obligations. While some Norman lords were fair and just, others treated their new lands as spoils of war, exploiting labor, seizing livestock, and punishing resistance with brutal force. This created resentment that would later fuel uprisings, particularly in the north. Despite the hardships, William's system brought a new sense of order. Clear hierarchies were established. Every landowner owed something to the king, whether military service, money, or grain. This feudal structure allowed William to monitor power, control resources, and maintain an army capable of suppressing rebellions. By reshaping land ownership, William reshaped the entire identity of England. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility faded into memory, replaced by a new Norman elite whose influence would endure for centuries. As Norman rule tightened across England, the cultural differences between the conquerors and the conquered became increasingly visible. England in 1066 had been a largely unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom with its own language, customs, architecture, and laws. But within months of William's coronation, the cultural landscape of the country began to transform in ways that no one could have predicted. The Normans brought with them not only military might, but an entirely different worldview, shaped by centuries of Frankish influence, Roman traditions, and continental European sophistication. The most obvious change was language. The Anglo-Saxons spoke Old English, a Germanic language that had developed from the speech of early settlers. The Normans, however, spoke Old Norman French, a language used in courts, legal documents, diplomacy, and aristocratic life. Very quickly, French became the language of power. All official discussions, royal orders, and legal arguments were conducted in French or Latin. Anglo-Saxon nobles who wanted to survive politically were forced to learn the new language. Meanwhile, the common people continued speaking Old English, creating a sharp divide between the rulers and the ruled. Over the next centuries, this blending of languages would produce Middle English, the ancestor of the English we speak today. Law also changed dramatically. Under Anglo-Saxon rule, justice had been based on tradition, community courts, and compensation for wrongdoing. The Normans introduced strict feudal laws, harsher punishments, and a stronger role for the king in legal matters. Trials by ordeal, such as carrying hot iron or plunging hands into boiling water, became more common. William also enforced curfews in some towns and expanded his control over the church's legal authority. The combination of Norman legal traditions and Anglo-Saxon customs gradually formed a new English legal system that would later influence the development of common law across the world. Architecture, too, experienced a revolution. Anglo-Saxon buildings had been mostly wooden structures with simple designs. The Normans introduced Romanesque architecture, stone churches with heavy walls, thick pillars, rounded arches, and imposing towers. The large stone cathedrals and castles built during William's early reign stood as symbols of permanence. They communicated a simple message. The Normans were here not as temporary conquerors, but as permanent rulers. Daily life also changed in subtle but significant ways. Clothing styles shifted toward Norman fashion. Hairstyles followed continental trends. Food preparation began to include more French influences. Even attitudes toward hunting, marriage, inheritance, and warfare evolved as English society absorbed Norman customs. Over time, the two cultures began to merge, creating a hybrid Anglo-Norman identity that laid the foundation for medieval England's future. But at the heart of all this cultural transformation was tension. Resentment simmered beneath the surface as English citizens saw their traditions replaced, their language marginalized, and their noble families displaced. William's rule may have brought order, but it also created a deep sense of loss among the Anglo-Saxon people, a loss that would soon erupt into rebellion. By the early months of 1067, the initial shock of the Norman Conquest had begun to fade, and in its place rose a simmering anger that touched nearly every corner of England. The Anglo-Saxon population had suffered defeat, humiliation, confiscation of land, foreign lords, new languages, and unfamiliar laws. William had expected some resistance. Every conqueror does. But even he could not have predicted how deeply resentment would carve itself into the English identity. The rebellions that began to spread were not isolated events. They were the natural outcome of an entire nation feeling displaced in its own homeland. The anger started at the local level, among small communities and villages. Many English families had lost their land to Norman knights who often did not care about centuries-old customs. What had once been shared community property became private Norman estates guarded by armed soldiers. Taxes increased to fund William's castle-building projects and pay his foreign troops. Even the church, once a pillar of stability, felt the shock as Norman bishops replaced English ones, bringing new rules and stricter discipline. Everywhere the English looked, they saw reminders that they were now subjects under a foreign power. Much of the resentment focused on the behavior of some Norman soldiers. Although William attempted to enforce discipline, many of his men acted like conquerors rather than guardians. Reports circulated of soldiers seizing livestock without payment, demanding excessive food from villagers, harassing women, and punishing minor offenses with brutal force. Every act of injustice, whether real or exaggerated, spread quickly through rumor. In a society where oral tradition carried enormous influence, stories of Norman cruelty fueled a rising desire for revenge. Another critical factor was the displacement of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. Many surviving nobles found themselves stripped of authority and forced into submission beneath younger Norman lords who had none of their experience or local respect. These nobles, particularly in the north and west, became natural leaders for rebellion. They understood military organization. They had loyal men willing to follow them, and they possessed deep-root ties to their regions. If they could unite, they believed they could drive the Normans from England altogether. At the heart of this growing unrest was a collective identity crisis. For centuries, the English had been proud of their kingship, their customs, and their relative independence from continental Europe. Now, within a matter of months, all of that seemed to slip away. The feeling of being ruled by outsiders who didn't speak their language or respect their traditions, pushed the population closer to rebellion with every passing day. William, from his throne in London, sensed the tension building like storm clouds across the land. He knew that rebellion was no longer a question of if, but when. The only question was how devastating the coming storms would be, and how much force he would need to suppress them. The first major rebellions began in 1067, less than a year after William's coronation. Although the early uprisings were small and disorganized, they signaled the beginning of a larger resistance movement that would challenge Norman rule for years. Each rebellion, no matter how easily crushed, served as inspiration for the next, like sparks igniting dry grass across a windswept field. The earliest uprising occurred in Kent, where local English leaders attempted to storm Dover Castle, one of the strongest Norman fortifications. Their hope was that destroying the castle would send a message that the English were not helpless subjects. However, the Norman garrison defended the fortress with fierce discipline, and the rebels were forced to retreat. Although the rebellion failed, it showed that English resistance was growing bolder and more organized. Shortly after, unrest erupted in the southwest, where the people of Exeter refused to pay taxes imposed by the Normans. William personally marched his army to the city, determined to make an example out of any town that defied him. Exeter resisted for 18 days, a remarkable display of courage. But once William's engineers undermined the walls and his troops breached the city, the defenders surrendered. Exeter was spared from total destruction, but the message was clear. Defiance would be crushed swiftly and without mercy. The Midlands and the Welsh borderlands soon followed with their own outbreaks of rebellion. Here, powerful nobles such as Edric the Wild teamed up with Welsh allies to strike Norman outposts. Their attacks were swift, coordinated, and designed to disrupt Norman supply routes rather than engage in large battles. Although these rebellions did not shake William's control directly, they forced him to allocate more troops to secure the Western Front, stretching his forces thin and revealing the vulnerabilities of his growing empire. Meanwhile, in Northumbria, the most volatile region of the kingdom, rebellion began to take the form of a full-scale uprising. Northumbria had always been semi-independent, with deep Viking roots and a fierce cultural identity. The arrival of Norman rulers, many of whom had no understanding of Northumbrian customs, was treated not merely as an offense, but as an outright provocation. Rebellions grew rapidly in the region, fueled by anger over the appointment of Norman governors who administered harsh punishments, disregarded local traditions, and demanded heavy taxes. By 1068, multiple rebellions were erupting simultaneously across England. William faced a kingdom that was beginning to slip out of his control. But before the situation spiraled into total chaos, He launched a coordinated campaign to crush the uprisings, demonstrating both his ruthlessness and his strategic brilliance. Each rebellion was put down with overwhelming force, leaving behind a trail of burned villages, executed rebels, and newly fortified Norman garrisons. Yet even as William marched from one region to the next, crushing each rebellion in turn, he sensed that the greatest threat had not yet come. Something larger, more dangerous, and far more destructive was brewing in the north, an uprising that would test his control over England like nothing he had faced before. If England was a storm, then the north was its lightning, unpredictable, powerful, and capable of striking without warning. Northumbria had always been a unique land within England, rugged, isolated, heavily influenced by Danish settlers, and fiercely protective of its independence. Even before the Norman invasion, kings in London struggled to control the region. Now, with William on the throne, Northumbria became the center of resistance and rebellion. The people of the north did not see themselves as just another part of England. They saw themselves as a proud warrior society with traditions older than the Norman duchy itself. The first major spark came when William appointed a Norman named Robert de Comines as Earl of Northumbria. The people despised him even before he arrived. Robert traveled to Durham with a small force, confident in his authority. But he underestimated the fury of the Northumbrians. As soon as he entered the city, the locals ambushed him, killed him, and wiped out his men. It was not a rebellion, it was an execution. Word of this attack spread quickly, and it became a symbol of northern defiance. The rebellion gained momentum when Edgar Atheling, the young heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal line, joined the cause. Having previously submitted to William, Edgar now saw an opportunity to reclaim the throne with the support of the North. His arrival electrified the rebels. Suddenly, their struggle had legitimacy, purpose, and a figurehead. Northumbria was no longer just resisting foreign rule. It was pushing to restore the old English monarchy. But what made the Northumbrian rebellion truly dangerous was the involvement of foreign powers. The Danes, whose ancestors had ruled parts of England for generations, saw an opportunity to re-establish their influence. King Sweyn II of Denmark sent a powerful fleet to England to support the uprising, turning the rebellion into an international conflict. With Danish ships in the rivers, Northumbrian warriors on the hills, and Edgar Atheling rallying support, William faced the most serious threat to his reign. The rebels struck hard, targeting Norman garrisons and attacking strategic points. York, one of the most important cities in northern England, erupted into chaos. The rebels destroyed Norman fortifications and killed hundreds of soldiers. For a moment, it looked as though the Normans were being driven out of the region entirely. But William was not a king who tolerated defiance. He knew that if he lost control of the north, the entire kingdom could collapse. He gathered a massive army and marched toward Northumbria, determined to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. What followed would become one of the most infamous and brutal episodes in medieval English history. The Harrying of the North, a campaign so devastating that it would leave scars on the land for generations. By the close of 1069, the Northern Rebellion had reached a scale that threatened not just Norman control, but William's entire claim to the English throne. He realized that the uprising was no longer a temporary disturbance. It had become a symbol of English resistance, a rallying cry for all who opposed him. It involved local nobles, common villagers, Danish fleets, and supporters of Edgar Atheling. If left unchecked, it could spread to the Midlands, the West, and perhaps even inspire the South to rise again. William knew he could not simply defeat the rebels. He had to destroy the very possibility of rebellion. This realization marked a turning point. Until this moment, William's rule, though strict, had not been defined by extreme brutality. But what he planned for Northumbria would become one of the most devastating military campaigns in medieval European history. William prepared to unleash his full wrath, calculated, merciless, and aimed not only at rebel leaders, but at the land itself. His strategy was simple: break the spirit of the North so completely that it would never again have the strength to rise. William began by gathering the largest army he had ever assembled on English soil. Troops marched from Normandy. Mercenaries were hired from across Europe, and Norman knights stationed in southern England rode north to join the force. The army that followed William was not merely a military machine. It was a tool of destruction built to erase resistance. William ordered the preparation of supply wagons, siege equipment, and engineering teams, not to conquer castles, but to tear down entire towns and villages. The message to his commanders was chillingly clear: leave nothing that can support life. Before marching north, William also addressed the political dimensions of the rebellion. He targeted the alliances that had allowed the uprising to flourish. The Danes, who had originally landed to support Edgar Atheling, were bribed heavily by William. Instead of fighting, they agreed to withdraw their fleet and return home, leaving the English rebels without their most important ally. This strategic bribe demonstrated William's mastery in using diplomacy alongside violence. Now, he could focus entirely on crushing the English, confident that no foreign power would intervene. In early winter of 1069, William and his massive army marched into Northumbria. The timing was intentional. Winter warfare was brutal, but William wanted to maximize suffering. Food stores were at their lowest, villages were vulnerable, and the weather made escape nearly impossible. As the Norman army approached, the rebels who had once filled York with triumph suddenly found themselves facing an unstoppable force. William did not come as a ruler seeking peace. He came as a conqueror whose patience had run out. The stage was set for a campaign that would become infamous across history. A campaign in which William would reshape the land through fire, famine, and fear. The harrying of the North had begun, and the full weight of Norman power was about to fall upon an already suffering region. As William's forces swept into Northumbria, their method was systematic and brutal. They didn't simply attack rebel strongholds. They destroyed the foundation of life itself. Norman troops moved from village to village, burning every house, barn, and food store they encountered. Livestock were slaughtered or seized. Mills were destroyed, and farmlands were burned until they could no longer produce crops. The aim was not to defeat an army. It was to starve the region into submission. This was total war, centuries ahead of its time. Most medieval campaigns targeted fortresses, battlefields, or political leaders. But William understood that Northumbria's strength came not from its castles, but from its fiercely independent people and their ability to support one another. As long as the land produced food, rebellions could continue. So William ordered that the land itself should be punished. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that from the Humber to the Tees, not an ox was left, not a plow survived, not a field remained unruined. Whether exaggerated or not, the destruction was vast. The human cost was unimaginable. Families fled into the freezing wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Entire villages that had existed for generations vanished within days. William's troops ensured that nothing, neither home nor barn nor grain, would provide comfort to anyone who dared resist. Norman soldiers carried torches, axes, and lances, moving with tireless discipline. Their destruction was so complete that even rebels hiding in the hills soon found themselves facing starvation. While villages burned, the city of York suffered a particularly harsh fate. Already damaged by earlier fighting, York became the centerpiece of William's wrath. Norman forces tore down houses, burned markets, and leveled large sections of the city to prevent it from ever becoming a hub of rebellion again. The two castles in York were reinforced and expanded, becoming symbols of Norman dominance in a land that once prided itself on rejecting foreign kings. Those who attempted to resist were crushed. Rebel groups confronted the Normans in small bands, hoping to catch isolated units off guard. But William's forces were too large, too organized, and too fueled by a king's determination. Many rebels were cut down where they stood, while others fled north toward the Scottish border. The Normans pursued them relentlessly, leaving destruction in their wake. Winter made the suffering far worse. Families trying to escape the fires soon faced freezing temperatures and starvation. Without shelter, food, or firewood, many collapsed in the snow before reaching safety. Chroniclers later wrote that corpses lined the roads, and survivors resorted to desperate acts. Some records describe villagers digging through frozen earth in search of roots. Others tell of cannibalism in the hardest-hit regions. Whether every account was true or not, they reveal how complete the devastation had become. By the time William's army had completed its sweep, Northumbria was broken. The land that had once stood proudly against foreign rule lay silent under smoke and ash. The northern spirit had not disappeared, but it had been crushed beneath a king who was determined that no English rebellion would ever again threaten his rule. When William finally withdrew his armies from Northumbria, the region was unrecognizable. Once thriving villages had turned into blackened skeletons of charred wood. Fields that had provided food for generations were nothing more than barren wastelands. Rivers ran past abandoned settlements, their mills silent and broken. The people who survived the harrying faced a desolation so total that it reshaped the identity of the region for decades. The famine that followed was especially severe. With crops destroyed, livestock dead, and food stores burned, thousands of people starved. Chroniclers estimated that over 100,000 men, women, and children died in the aftermath, an enormous number for the medieval era. Some historians debate the exact figure, but all agree on one thing: the famine was catastrophic. Entire families perished during the winter of 1069 to 1070, leaving behind empty lands where communities once thrived. William's purpose had been clear. Never again would the North challenge Norman authority. In this, he succeeded brutally. The rebellion was crushed so thoroughly that no major uprising emerged from Northumbria for many years. Even the descendants of the survivors passed down stories of the devastation, stories that painted William as a tyrant, a destroyer, and a ruler who conquered through fear rather than justice. But the harrying of the North had consequences beyond terror. It disrupted the economy of northern England for generations. Farmland became useless for years, reducing trade and weakening the kingdom's northern defense. The destruction also forced William to repopulate the region with Norman settlers, permanently reshaping the cultural landscape. Norman knights established new estates, built new castles, and brought continental customs into a land that had once resisted even the slightest foreign influence. The church responded with mixed reactions. Some bishops condemned William's brutality, arguing that his actions were not justified by Christian law. Others defended him, claiming that harsh measures were necessary to secure peace. William himself seemed unshaken. He believed that the rebellions had left him no choice, that the survival of his kingdom depended on breaking the northern spirit once and for all. For William personally, the harrying solidified his reputation across Europe. To his supporters, he became a ruler of unstoppable strength, a king who would defend his throne at any cost. To his enemies, he became a figure of fear, a man whose wrath could devastate entire regions. Whether admired or despised, William had proven one thing beyond doubt. He was not merely the conqueror of England. He was its master. As the smoke of the north faded and the land began its slow journey toward recovery, William turned his attention to a new challenge: consolidating long-term control, reforming governance, and managing threats not only inside England but across the Channel and Normandy. The conquest was not over. The next phase of William's rule was about to begin. As darkness settled over the Norman encampment on the night before the Battle of Hastings, a heavy silence spread through the tents. William's army had marched, waited, trained, and prayed for weeks, and now the moment they had crossed the sea was almost within reach. The moon cast a pale light across the sprawling camp, reflecting off helmets and shields stacked in readiness for dawn. Horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension of the men beside them. Fires crackled softly, and the smell of smoke, sweat, and wet grass filled the air. William moved through the camp with controlled confidence, speaking to his captains, reminding them of their roles, and strengthening their resolve. He knew that leadership at this moment mattered more than at any other time in his life. Every step he took was deliberate, every word carefully chosen. His knights looked at him not just as their duke, but as the man who would lead them to reshape the destiny of an entire kingdom. Many of these men had fought alongside him for years, surviving rebellions, brutal campaigns, and political storms. They trusted him with their lives, and William knew he had to prove himself worthy of that trust. Throughout the camp, priests walked among the soldiers, blessing them, offering prayers, and reminding them that their cause had been sanctioned by the Pope. This religious backing was no small matter. Many Norman soldiers believed they were not just fighting for land or victory, but for God's approval. A holy banner, gifted by the Pope himself, stood planted in the center of the camp, fluttering weakly in the night wind. It symbolized divine legitimacy and filled the warriors with a mixture of courage and fear. They wanted to honor God, but they also knew the brutal reality of battle. Some whispered to each other, asking if this would be their last night alive. Others sharpened their swords with determination, ready to carve their names into history. In the distance, the faint outline of Senlac Hill loomed like a sleeping giant. Beyond that hill, Harold Godwinson and his Saxon army prepared in their own way. William knew he had to fight uphill. He had to break a wall of shields, and he had to face men defending their homeland. But he also believed in the superiority of his strategy, training, and cavalry. For William, the final hours were not a time for doubt. They were a time to shape the next morning into the greatest triumph of his life, or die trying. Harold Godwinson's army, gathered across the ridge of Senlac Hill, had a very different mood on the eve of the battle. Unlike the Norman camp, where many soldiers had been waiting for weeks, Harold's men had arrived only hours earlier after a punishing march from the north. They had defeated Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in a battle that nearly broke them. Many wore bandages under their mail shirts, still aching from wounds. Their bodies were weary and their spirits stretched thin, but their loyalty to Harold remained unshaken. They stood ready to protect their homes, their families, and their king. The English camp was simpler than the Norman one. Most soldiers slept under the open sky or huddled near small fires. They carried round shields decorated with colorful patterns, spears with worn shafts, and axes polished for the coming fight. On the high ground of Senlac Hill, they formed a long defensive line, organizing themselves into the famous Saxon shield wall. This formation was known across Europe for its reliability and power. When Saxons locked their shields together, shoulder to shoulder, they became almost impossible to break in frontal combat. It was as much a sign of unity as it was a military tactic. Harold walked the line, listening to reports from his thanes and giving encouragement to those who needed it. He understood the exhaustion of his men, but he also sensed their determination. Many of these warriors were ferdmen, ordinary farmers who left their plows and barns behind to fight for their country. Others were housecarls, elite Saxon troops with double-bladed axes capable of cutting through shields and armor. These men had fought battles with Harold for years, and they trusted him with unwavering loyalty. But beneath the courage, there was also a quiet fear. Rumors spread through the ranks about William's cavalry, about the skill of the Norman archers, and about their disciplined infantry. Many had never fought mounted knights before. Some whispered prayers to God, asking for protection. Others carved small crosses into the dirt. The tension was heavy, but there was also pride, the pride of defending England from foreign invasion. As the sky darkened, Harold looked southward toward the Norman fires. He knew the coming battle would define not just his reign, but the future of England. If he won, he would go down in history as the king who saved his homeland. If he lost, everything, the crown, the culture, the laws, the language, could fall into foreign hands. The weight of that truth pressed on him, but he stood firm, knowing that the dawn would bring a fight that would echo through centuries. The night between the two armies was unervingly still, as if the world itself held its breath. Across the fields, the distant glow of torchlight flickered between the Norman and English camps like faint stars on the earth. Animals were restless, sensing the tension in the air. The countryside of Sussex, usually peaceful, now felt like a battleground waiting to awaken. Between the camps, the villagers who had not fled earlier remained hidden in their homes, terrified of what would come with sunrise. They could hear the distant murmuring of thousands of soldiers, the neighing of war horses, and the metallic clatter of weapons being prepared. Some prayed for deliverance, others for survival. They knew that whatever happened the next day, their lives would be changed forever. This night was also a moment of reflection for both leaders. William, in his tent, considered the enormous risks he had taken. He had built ships, gathered soldiers from across Normandy and Europe, bribed allies, secured papal support, and crossed a dangerous sea. Everything he dreamed of, the throne of England, the wealth of its lands, and the expansion of Norman power, depended on a single day. If he failed, he would lose everything. If he succeeded, he would reshape the history of Western Europe. Harold, meanwhile, sat with his closest housecarls atop Senlac Hill. He knew the terrain well and believed it gave him an advantage, but he could not ignore the fatigue of his troops. He wondered whether God had chosen this moment to test him or punish him. His thoughts drifted briefly to his family, to the future he hoped to secure, and to the fear of losing everything he had fought to protect. Yet despite these doubts, Harold resolved to face whatever destiny awaited him. As the final hours of darkness passed, both armies tried to rest, though sleep was scarce. Some soldiers muttered stories of past battles. Some stared into the flames, lost in thought. Others clutched symbols of faith close to their chests. Soon the sun would rise, casting light over the field where thousands would fall. This night was not merely the eve of a battle. It was the threshold between two eras, the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a new chapter that would define the future. Before dawn broke, history hovered in silence, waiting for the moment it would erupt into chaos, bravery, fear, and destiny. At first light on the morning of October 14th, 1066, a pale golden sun rose slowly over the hills of Sussex, casting long shadows across the battlefield that would soon become one of the most legendary landscapes in English history. The dew on the grass sparkled faintly, though it was quickly crushed under the boots of soldiers forming into their positions. The crisp cold of dawn carried a strange mix of excitement and dread. Every man on that field knew the next few hours would decide the fate of a kingdom. As Harold's English army roused from restless sleep, they quietly took their places along the ridge of Senlac Hill, forming the massive shield wall that had protected their ancestors for generations. This defensive line stretched across the entire hilltop, its edges disappearing into the morning mist. Housecarls in heavy armor took the front row, gripping their massive double-headed axes with both hands. Ferdmen stood behind them, clutching spears, axes, and wooden shields painted with colorful designs. Their breath fogged in the cold air as they tightened their formation, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. Some soldiers crossed themselves. Some muttered prayers. Others tried to steel their nerves by recalling victories of old, battles against Vikings, rebels, and invaders. They were defending their homeland, and they stood together like a wall of oak trees, unbroken and unmoving. Harold Godwinson, wearing a mail coat and carrying the golden dragon banner of Wessex, rode along the line to give strength to his men. His voice echoed in the growing light, reminding them of their families, their farms, and their duty. He told them they fought not for ambition, but for England itself. The men cheered, though the sound carried the weight of fear mixed with determination. Harold's face revealed a man who understood the gravity of this battle. He had survived Stamford Bridge, he had reclaimed the North, and now he stood ready to face a second invasion in just 3 weeks. Few kings had ever faced two threats of this magnitude so close together. Down the slope, the Normans also began to assemble, their camp coming to life with clattering armor, snorting horses, and shouted commands. William's army, composed of Normans, Bretons, Flemish warriors, and mercenaries, organized with methodical discipline. Columns of infantry formed ranks, archers prepared their arrows, and knights mounted heavily armored horses that pawed the ground impatiently. The sound of horns echoed through the valley as William appeared on horseback, calm and confident. He surveyed the English line atop the hill and understood the difficulty before him. Breaking that wall would require precision, patience, and extraordinary courage. But William had crossed the sea for this moment. He could not and would not turn back. As the sun rose higher, lighting both armies fully, the battlefield transformed from peaceful countryside to a stage set for destruction. The men tightened their grips on swords, shields, and spears. The smell of damp earth mingled with fear. The world felt strangely quiet for a moment, a silence so deep that even the birds seemed unwilling to sing. Then, slowly, the first Norman horns sounded, long and low, announcing the beginning of a battle that would echo across centuries. William the Conqueror understood that the English shield wall, positioned on the high ridge, would not be broken by reckless charges. So before a single arrow flew, He reviewed his plan once more with his commanders. The Norman strategy relied on something unusual for the time: coordination between three different types of troops: archers, infantry, and cavalry, used in successive waves. It was a system that no English army had faced before, and one that made Norman warfare far more flexible and deadly. The first wave will be the archers. Their job was not simply to kill, but to disrupt, to weaken, and to create openings. William instructed them to aim high, to send volleys and arcs so the arrows would fall behind shields or hit exposed faces. He hoped the English would be forced to break formation or lift shields upward, creating vulnerabilities for the next wave. Behind the archers waited the infantry, foot soldiers armed with spears, swords, and round shields. They would march up the hill and engage hand-to-hand, pushing, slashing, and attempting to pry apart the English line. William knew it was a difficult task, pushing uphill against a tightly locked shield wall designed specifically to resist frontal assault. But he believed his infantry could at least tire the defenders or create confusion. The third wave, the most feared of all, was his cavalry. Norman knights were not simply horsemen. They were trained warriors who fought with lances underarm, a technique that allowed their charges to hit with crushing force. Few armies in Europe could withstand a disciplined cavalry attack, and the English, fighting mostly on foot, were especially vulnerable to it. William planned to send in his cavalry only after the English were weakened or disorganized, when a shield wall showed signs of stress. He believed in the speed, momentum, and weight of his mounted knights. If they found a gap, they could tear the shield wall apart from within. William rode before his troops, delivering final commands. His voice was steady, and his eyes scanned the battlefield with the calm intensity of a man who knew he needed more than strength. He needed brilliance. He reminded his men that their cause was blessed, that God stood with them, and that the throne of England awaited those who fought bravely. Many knights tapped their lances against their shields in response, creating a hollow echo that rippled across the ranks. The Breton troops on the left flank, known for their agility and unpredictable fighting style, were eager but restless. William assigned them crucial roles in flanking maneuvers. The Flemish soldiers in the center steadied themselves, gripping their weapons and adjusting helmets. The Norman knights on the right flank checked their horses' reins, ensuring everything was ready for the moment of the charge. By now, the morning sun revealed the full scale of both armies. Thousands of soldiers faced each other across a hill that would soon be stained with blood. William raised his arm, holding it high. His commanders readied their men. Archers knocked arrows. Infantry tightened grips. Cavalry waited in tense silence. The first horn blast signaled the beginning of the Norman advance. With a loud, rising cry, the Norman archers stepped forward. They planted their feet, pulled their bowstrings tight, and released the first deadly wave. Arrows shot upward into the morning sky, darkening the air for a moment before descending in graceful arcs. The sound of whistling missiles filled the battlefield, followed by the thuds of arrows hitting shields, ground, and occasionally flesh. The English shield wall reacted instantly. Housecarls raised their large wooden shields high and braced themselves. Ferdmen behind them ducked or huddled close. The rain of arrows struck the line, but did not break it. Shields absorbed most of the impact. A few unlucky men cried out as arrows pierced gaps or struck unarmored faces, but the overall formation held firm. Harold's troops knew this would happen. They were trained to stay still under missile fire, trusting their shields and discipline. William adjusted his plan. He ordered the archers to move closer and fire again. this time at a lower angle. But the English shields again provided remarkable protection. William could see clearly what he had suspected. The English shield wall was nearly impenetrable by arrows alone. But the missiles had served their purpose. They forced the English to brace, and they signaled the beginning of the real assault. The second wave arrived. Norman infantry surged forward with shouts and battle cries, climbing the steep incline toward the English line. The foot soldiers clashed violently against the shield wall, striking shields with swords and thrusting spears into any opening they could find. But the English defense held strong. Housecarls swung their massive axes downward, cutting through Norman shields and helmets. Every time a Norman tried to force a breakthrough, the wall absorbed the impact like a living fortress. Bodies fell on each side, and the sound of metal against metal grew deafening. But the Normans could make little headway. Even the steepness of the hill worked against them, slowing their advance and weakening their blows. Many stumbled back, slipping on the grass wet with dew and blood. Then the third wave prepared the cavalry. As the infantry struggled, William signaled his mounted knights. The ground shook with the roar of hooves. Horses snorted, knights lowered their lances, and the entire right flank of the Norman force began to gallop toward the English position. The moment the cavalry began its charge, the morning air filled with a terrifying mix of speed, power, and thunder. The English braced themselves. The shield wall tightened. Spears angled outward to meet the horses. This charge would mark the true test of the English line and begin the most famous phase of the Battle of Hastings. The thunder of hooves rolled across the hillside as William's cavalry advanced toward the English shield wall. The ground trembled beneath the weight of armored knights, and the air was filled with the shrill clamor of battle cries, the braying of horses, and the ringing of swords striking shields. For a moment, the Normans seemed unstoppable, a living wave of destruction charging toward a determined, steadfast enemy. The English defenders tightened their formation, holding their massive shields so tightly that gaps were nearly impossible to penetrate. Every foot of ground they stood on was precious. To lose even an inch would invite disaster. The first contact was devastating for both sides. Norman lances struck with enormous force, splintering shields and knocking men to the ground. Horses reared and screamed as they hit the solid wall of wood and iron. The English housecarls, elite warriors armed with massive two-handed axes, stood firm, swinging downward with such power that some mounted knights were thrown from their horses. Many Norman foot soldiers pressed alongside, attempting to support the cavalry, but the steep incline and disciplined defense made the climb exhausting. Bodies collided in a violent jumble, dust and sweat mixing with the cold morning air, as the clash became nearly a living entity, a chaotic dance of death. William rode among his men, raising his sword and signaling new attacks, urging his knights to regroup and strike again. He understood that sheer brute force alone would not break the wall. He had to test the discipline of the English, create openings, and exploit any small mistakes. The Normans tried feigned retreats, a tactic William had perfected, luring parts of the shield wall downhill in pursuit, hoping to fragment their cohesion. Some of the English took the bait, chasing the fleeing cavalry, leaving brief but critical gaps in the wall. The Normans pounced, exploiting these openings, slashing through defenders and forcing deadly hand-to-hand combat where shields and swords collided with a terrifying rhythm. Despite the ferocity, the shield wall endured. Men pressed their shields together, bracing against the weight of the horses, while axes and spears were swung from behind and in between. The English were relentless, their desperation fueled by knowledge that defeat would mean death and the loss of their homeland. They had survived before against fierce enemies, and the memory of the North, of Stamford Bridge, reminded them that persistence, discipline, and unity could defy even the strongest forces. As hours passed, the battlefield became a mixture of mud, blood, and debris. Arrows, once effective against static lines, became less deadly, yet they continued to rain upon both sides, causing chaos and inflicting hidden injuries. Knights fell, soldiers screamed, and men fought over the bodies of their comrades. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the acrid scent of iron. It was a clash of strategy, endurance, and sheer willpower. At this stage, no one could predict who would emerge victorious. Yet William remained calm and methodical. He rotated his troops, sent in fresh infantry, and adjusted his cavalry charges according to what he saw. Each wave was calculated, each maneuver precise. He understood that breaking the shield wall required a combination of timing, deception, and brute force, a fact that had eluded many other generals for centuries. This battle, he knew, was not simply fought with swords and lances. It was fought with patience, cunning, and an unbreakable will. The English did not remain passive. As the Normans pressed forward, Harold's housecarls and furdmen launched counterattacks that shook the invaders. They surged downhill in tightly packed formations, swinging axes and thrusting spears with deadly precision. The Normans, caught in the steep terrain, found themselves pushed back by a disciplined, coordinated strike. The sound of shields shattering and armor denting echoed through the morning air, each impact a testament to the determination of the English defenders. Saxons charged with such ferocity that some Norman knights were unhorsed or struck down. Archers, previously behind the main line, rushed forward to support the shield wall, shooting arrows into gaps created by fallen cavalry. Infantry pressed simultaneously from the flanks, engaging the Normans in close-quarters combat where swords, axes, and maces became instruments of survival. The initial momentum of the Norman assault began to waver, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the English might repel the invaders entirely. Harold, positioned at the center of the line, rode along the ranks, shouting encouragement and issuing commands. His presence inspired his men to hold fast despite exhaustion and injuries. The shield wall was tested, battered, and strained, yet the cohesion of the English forces remained impressive. Even as Normans regrouped and launched further charges, the Saxons' defensive tactics kept them upright. They used their knowledge of the hill to anchor the line, forcing Normans to exhaust themselves uphill while defenders leveraged gravity and momentum to their advantage. During this stage of the battle, mistakes by both sides became costly. Missteps in coordination, accidental gaps, or faltering morale could lead to sudden, deadly consequences. Some Norman knights pressed too aggressively, finding themselves surrounded by angry housecarls. Some English fighters overextended, leaving brief openings that Norman infantry quickly exploited. These micro-clashes added layers of unpredictability, making the battlefield seem like a living, chaotic organism, constantly shifting as soldiers pushed, fell, and surged again. Yet despite these temporary victories, Harold knew that holding the line indefinitely was a massive gamble. The Normans were adaptable, experienced, and willing to use deception. Feigned retreats, targeted cavalry maneuvers, and concentrated archery were part of William's plan. Every engagement seemed to test the English resolve, patience, and endurance. By late morning, both sides were locked in a deadly stalemate, bruised and battered, but unbroken, each waiting for a critical moment that could decide the course of history. The clash was not simply about soldiers. It was about leadership, strategy, morale, and willpower. William watched for weaknesses, Harold responded to attacks, and the men fought for survival, for their king, and for the soul of England. Every heartbeat carried the weight of destiny. Every swing of an axe or lance was a gamble in a game where the stakes were nothing less than life, death, and the fate of a nation. By mid-morning, the first signs of William's cunning strategy began to emerge. Recognizing the strength of the English shield wall and the stamina of its defenders, William ordered a series of feigned retreats. Groups of Norman cavalry and infantry began to pull back, deliberately giving the impression that they were retreating in panic. This tactic was designed to provoke the English into breaking formation, a weakness the Normans could exploit. The shield wall, disciplined but human, reacted predictably. Some furdmen, thinking the Normans were fleeing, chased after them downhill. This broke part of the cohesive line, creating small but critical gaps. In these moments, Norman knights turned abruptly, charging into the disorganized English sections. Spears pierced through gaps, horses trampled exposed defenders, and chaos erupted where moments before there had been order. William's feigned retreats were not mindless tricks. They were precise psychological attacks aimed at exploiting human behavior in the heat of battle. As this unfolded, the psychological toll on the English became apparent. Men who had fought bravely now faced uncertainty, betrayal by perceived weakness, and the overwhelming coordination of the Norman forces. Arrows flew into the gaps, while infantry pressed forward to consolidate the breach. The shield wall, once a solid entity, was forced to stretch and bend, testing the cohesion of even the most disciplined soldiers. Housecarls fought valiantly to patch openings, swinging axes and rallying troops, but the Normans seized the advantage wherever possible. The battle transformed from a direct confrontation to a series of deadly maneuvers. Cavalry struck and withdrew, infantry exploited openings, and archers continued to rain arrows from behind the lines. Each wave of attack wore down the English defenders physically and mentally. Soldiers struggled to maintain footing, the slope of the hill causing fatigue, while continuous assaults kept adrenaline and fear at peak levels. Injuries mounted, exhaustion increased, and morale, though still strong, began to waver. Harold himself fought at the front, moving along the line to encourage and inspire his men. His presence was vital, but the battle scale made coordination increasingly difficult. Each section of the line faced individual challenges, and gaps that could not be immediately reinforced became fatal opportunities for the Normans. William's adaptability and relentless pressure slowly turned the battle in his favor, demonstrating that strategy, cunning, and endurance could outweigh even the strongest defensive formation. By late morning, the Battle of Hastings had shifted from an evenly matched conflict to a contest of attrition. Both sides had inflicted massive casualties, yet the Normans, using deception, tactical flexibility, and superior coordination between archers, infantry, and cavalry, had begun to exploit weaknesses in the English line. The outcome remained uncertain, but the foundations for a Norman victory were being laid, step by step, maneuver by maneuver, deception by deception. By early afternoon, the English shield wall, once considered an unbreakable formation, began to show the first cracks. Hours of continuous combat, relentless pressure from cavalry charges, and the ceaseless volley of Norman arrows had exhausted the defenders. The men of Harold's army had been fighting uphill for hours, their muscles burning, armor heavy and unyielding, and morale tested by feigned retreats and sudden cavalry surges. Though the shield wall held firm in many sections, small gaps began to appear, revealing the vulnerability that William had sought to exploit. The Normans, disciplined and organized, noticed these weaknesses immediately. William himself moved among his knights, shouting commands and pointing toward breaches in the line. His voice carried across the battlefield, instilling courage in his men and signaling precise moments to strike. Norman archers intensified their volleys, targeting the weak points to force English defenders to raise shields in response. Each shield lifted created another small opening, an opportunity for infantry or cavalry to press forward and expand the breach. At the same time, the psychological toll on the English was mounting. Soldiers who had once been confident of victory now questioned the endurance of their comrades. Some of the ferdmen, already exhausted from marching to Hastings after fighting in the north, began to falter. Fatigue and fear, amplified by the relentless Norman tactics, caused disorder in small pockets along the line. Where once shields were interlocked like the scales of a dragon, now they were separated by inches, enough for a spear or a lance to penetrate. Harold remained at the heart of the shield wall, directing reinforcements and inspiring his men to hold. He rode along the ridge, axe in hand, his presence a beacon of leadership. He knew that if the wall were to collapse, the entire battle would be lost. Yet he also understood that some sections of his line were no longer impenetrable, and he had to make calculated decisions about where to reinforce, where to hold, and where to allow retreat to prevent total collapse. Every movement was a gamble. Every order could determine life or death for hundreds of men at a time. The Normans, for their part, exploited every opportunity. Cavalry charged into small openings, breaking lines that had held for hours. Infantry pressed forward relentlessly, using shields to push back tired Saxon fighters, while archers concentrated on newly exposed sections. William's combination of feigned retreats, tactical deception, and coordinated strikes was beginning to overwhelm the English defenses. The shield wall, which had been the centerpiece of Harold's strategy, now teetered under the unyielding Norman assault. The battlefield had transformed into a brutal landscape of chaos, sweat, and steel. Dust and blood mixed with the early autumn air as both sides fought with desperation. Each clash of sword against shield rang like thunder. Every arrow loose from Norman bows found its mark or created chaos among tightly packed Saxon formations. What had begun as a balanced contest of strength and strategy was now evolving into a fight for survival, with momentum slowly shifting toward William and his adaptive, relentless army. Recognizing that brute force alone could not shatter the English defense, William employed one of his most cunning strategies, the feigned retreat. Groups of Norman cavalry deliberately fell back, creating the illusion of panic and flight. Their intent was clear: provoke the English into abandoning their disciplined positions. Many English ferdmen, believing the Normans were retreating, pursued them down the hill, leaving gaps in the once solid shield wall. These gaps, though brief, were lethal. The moment the English overextended, Norman cavalry wheeled around and charged back with incredible speed, striking from unexpected angles. Spears and lances found exposed targets, and armor-clad knights crushed men who had broken formation. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had been confident moments before now realized that every movement could be a trap. What appeared to be an advantage became a fatal vulnerability, reinforcing William's strategic mastery. These feigned retreats were repeated multiple times throughout the battle, slowly weakening the cohesion of the English lines while keeping the Norman forces relatively fresh. Meanwhile, Norman infantry took advantage of these openings. Sword and shield became instruments not only of attack, but also of shoving, forcing weary Englishmen to bend under pressure. Archers rained arrows into the breaches, striking defenders in the back or distracting them from mounting counterattacks. The combination of physical and psychological pressure created a cascade effect, gradually destabilizing the once impenetrable shield wall. Every misstep by the English, no matter how small, was magnified by William's disciplined coordination. Harold himself became a focal point of the battle. Accounts indicate that he moved constantly along the line, attempting to plug gaps and rally his men. His leadership prevented total collapse, yet even his presence could not counter the relentless strategy executed by the Normans. Fatigue and injury were taking their toll, and men who had marched from the north and fought at Stamford Bridge days earlier struggled to keep pace with the intensity of the assault. Even housecarls, trained warriors accustomed to facing fierce opponents, were being tested to the limits of endurance. The battlefield, once orderly in its defensive formations, devolved into chaos in key sectors. Soldiers collided with comrades, miscommunication led to misaligned shields, and small groups were encircled and overwhelmed. Norman archers, infantry, and cavalry worked in synchrony, each unit aware of the timing and impact of the others. William's ability to orchestrate this complex operation on a chaotic battlefield demonstrated a remarkable combination of tactical acumen and psychological warfare. By exploiting human nature, the tendency to pursue retreating enemies, he created openings that would eventually decide the battle. By mid-afternoon, the cumulative effect of feigned retreats, relentless charges, and coordinated volleys had begun to fracture the shield wall in multiple places. English resistance remained fierce, but the once impenetrable defensive line was no longer invincible. Soldiers who had held the line for hours were now visibly strained, injuries mounting and morale faltering in pockets where Norman tactics had succeeded. The tide of battle, once balanced, was slowly turning in William's favor. As the afternoon's sun climbed higher, the strain on Harold's forces became painfully apparent. Fatigue, casualties, and the relentless pressure from Norman attacks had begun to wear down even the most disciplined defenders. Harold himself, constantly moving along the front line, directed men to hold, pushed reinforcements into critical gaps, and wielded his axe in battle. His courage and presence inspired his men, but the physical reality was clear. The shield wall, no matter how formidable, could not hold forever under such sustained assault. One particularly critical moment occurred when a Norman cavalry charge, combined with infantry and archers, struck a weakened section of the shield wall. The line buckled under the concentrated pressure, and a small but crucial portion of the English forces was driven backward. William immediately sent reinforcements into the breach, consolidating control and pushing the English further down the hill. What had been a minor opening now threatened to cascade into a larger collapse. The discipline of the English ferdmen and housecarls slowed the damage, but cracks were now evident across multiple sectors of the line. Harold's awareness of these vulnerabilities was constant. Reports from the front lines indicated casualties, gaps, and moments when men had chased feigned retreats, leaving isolated positions. Harold directed men to hold steady, but the repeated strain and human exhaustion made coordination increasingly difficult. For every section of the line reinforced, another was threatened. The battle had shifted from straightforward defense to a constant struggle to maintain cohesion, morale, and physical endurance. Even brief moments of disorder could have catastrophic consequences. The Normans, sensing opportunity, continued to press strategically rather than recklessly. Cavalry charges alternated with retreats. Archers concentrated fire on critical gaps, and infantry exploited every weakness. William's command ensured that fresh troops were always available to reinforce the assault. The combination of adaptive tactics and relentless pressure was slowly eroding the once mighty English defensive structure. By late afternoon, the stage was set for the decisive moments of the Battle of Hastings. The shield wall, though still formidable, had weakened enough for William to consider a final, concentrated effort to break through entirely. Both leaders knew the outcome of these next hours would determine the fate of England. Harold fought with the strength of desperation, but William's adaptability, strategic cunning, and relentless coordination were beginning to tip the scales irrevocably. The battlefield, now littered with the fallen and scarred by hours of intense combat, awaited the final, decisive moves that would echo through history. The moment was approaching when one leader's vision, strategy, and endurance would triumph, while the others would falter, forever changing the course of a nation. By late afternoon on October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings had reached a critical juncture. Hours of relentless combat had taken a heavy toll on Harold's forces. The shield wall, once an unbreakable fortress of Saxon defense, had been weakened repeatedly by feigned retreats, relentless cavalry charges, and well-coordinated volleys of Norman arrows. Exhaustion gnawed at every soldier, while injuries and fatigue further diminished their capacity to resist. Yet amidst this chaos, Harold remained at the center, a figure of unwavering resolve, rallying his men and personally wielding his axe against the relentless tide of Norman warriors. Harold understood the stakes, the survival of his men, the preservation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and the defense of his crown. His voice rang out over the din of battle, issuing commands, encouraging the injured, and shaming any who faltered. Even as his personal guard fought around him, Harold's attention was on the broader battlefield, seeking to plug gaps, coordinate counterattacks, and inspire confidence. But despite his efforts, the cumulative impact of Norman tactics was evident. Parts of the shield wall that had once stood firm were now stretched thin, leaving small, dangerous openings that William's forces exploited with brutal efficiency. Norman archers intensified their focus on the weakened sections, sending a storm of arrows downward that found vulnerable gaps in armor and shield alike. Cavalry surged through these breaches, trampling and impaling Saxon soldiers in a terrifying display of coordinated violence. Infantry pressed behind, using shields to shove and axes to strike, ensuring that the momentum favored the attackers. Amid the chaos, Harold's men fought desperately, using every ounce of strength to hold the line. Yet the ground beneath them, slick with blood and mud, worked against them, slowing movement and making recovery from injuries or fatigue nearly impossible. According to contemporary chronicles, Harold's personal bravery became the centerpiece of this stage of the battle. He fought atop the hill, striking down attackers with his axe and attempting to rally men who wavered under the weight of fear and exhaustion. His presence inspired courage, but even a king could not hold an army together indefinitely against such relentless pressure. Small gaps widened, units became isolated, and the cohesion of the shield wall, while still formidable, was under severe strain. In the distance, William watched carefully, coordinating his final maneuvers. He recognized that direct assault had weakened the line, but the ultimate objective required a combination of strategy, timing, and precision. His adaptability, ruthlessness, and mastery of battlefield psychology had steadily turned the tide. The final moments would not rely solely on the bravery of Norman soldiers, but on exploiting every weakness of the exhausted English army. Harold's resilience was remarkable, but the foundation beneath him had begun to crumble. The pivotal moment came as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Senlac Hill. In the midst of the battlefield chaos, an arrow struck Harold in the eye, according to most contemporary sources. The king, leader, and symbol of Anglo-Saxon England fell instantly, sending shockwaves through the ranks. Soldiers who had drawn courage from his presence were suddenly thrown into confusion and despair. The centralized focus that had held the shield wall together was gone, and the structure of the defense began to collapse. The impact of Harold's death was immediate. Units that had been maintaining cohesion splintered in the face of relentless attacks. Ferdman and housecarls alike struggled to identify new leaders, and morale plummeted. Norman forces, recognizing the significance of this event, intensified their assault. Cavalry charged with renewed vigor. Archers loosed arrow volleys with precision, and infantry pressed forward into weakened lines. The combination of tactical brilliance and the psychological blow of Harold's fall created a cascade effect, breaking the once formidable English defense. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene of utter chaos. Men fought desperately, some attempting to regroup, others fleeing downhill in panic. Normans exploited every gap, striking quickly and decisively. The battlefield became a mixture of mud, blood, and the cries of the dying and injured. The death of Harold not only symbolized the fall of a king, but also shattered the hope and cohesion of an entire army. Even those who had survived earlier engagements now faced the stark realization that resistance had become almost impossible. The Normans pressed relentlessly. Cavalry and infantry swept through exposed areas, while archers targeted any remaining concentrated groups of defenders. The psychological effect of the king's death compounded the physical devastation. Soldiers who might have continued to resist now hesitated, second-guessed their actions, or abandoned their positions altogether. William's careful orchestration had transformed the battlefield into an instrument of complete domination. Harold's leadership, which had provided a lifeline to his troops for hours, was gone, leaving a vacuum that could not be filled in the chaos of combat. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the remaining English forces fought with courage, but the coordinated, methodical assault of the Norman army had become unstoppable. What had begun as a battle of skill, discipline, and strategy had turned into a process of attrition, ending in the symbolic and literal collapse of Anglo-Saxon leadership. The death of Harold marked not just the loss of a king, but the effective end of organized resistance. In that moment, William's path to victory became clear, and the legacy of Anglo-Saxon England entered its final chapter. With Harold dead and the shield wall fractured beyond repair, the Normans completed their conquest of the battlefield. Survivors of the English forces either fled toward the forests and villages, were cut down in pursuit, or were captured. The scale of devastation was immense. Thousands of men lay dead, some in positions that spoke of desperate last stands, others where they had attempted to flee. The terrain of Senlac Hill itself became a graveyard, littered with the fallen, abandoned shields, shattered weapons, and the remnants of desperate resistance. William, mounted on his horse, surveyed the battlefield with a mix of satisfaction and strategic foresight. Victory had been achieved, but the work of consolidating it was only beginning. He ordered the surviving Norman troops to secure the area, care for wounded allies, and prevent looting that might have turned the local population against them. His control of the battlefield was total. The English army had been defeated decisively, their king dead, and their morale irreparably shattered. In the immediate aftermath, the local population witnessed the scale of the slaughter. Villages and towns, previously under Anglo-Saxon rule, now faced the reality of a new power. Survivors told stories of the slaughter on the hill, the bravery of the English defenders, and the methodical ruthlessness of William's forces. News spread quickly, and fear of Norman power began to permeate every corner of southern England. William understood that psychological dominance, alongside military conquest, was critical to maintaining control of a kingdom still largely loyal to Anglo-Saxon traditions. The strategic implications were profound. The death of Harold and the defeat at Hastings eliminated the primary organized resistance to Norman rule. William, while victorious on the battlefield, now needed to consolidate his political control, secure alliances, and integrate a complex system of governance to maintain his authority. The battle had secured the crown militarily, but the work of ruling England required diplomacy, administrative reform, and careful handling of the surviving Anglo-Saxon nobility. The battle also resonated across Europe. William's victory at Hastings was hailed as a triumph of strategy, organization, and leadership. Normans and other European powers began to recognize him not merely as a regional duke, but as a formidable monarch capable of reshaping kingdoms. Meanwhile, in England, the consequences were immediate. The end of Anglo-Saxon sovereignty, the beginning of Norman rule, and a cultural and political transformation that would define the nation for generations. The sun finally set over Senlac Hill, casting long shadows over a landscape irrevocably changed. The Battle of Hastings had concluded, but its impact, both immediate and enduring, would echo through centuries of English history. The old order had fallen, and a new era, Norman England, was born amidst the ashes, blood, and valor of one of history's most decisive confrontations. With the battlefield of Senlac Hill quieted, William's first challenge was not merely the elimination of the English army, but the consolidation of power across a kingdom that had never before faced Norman rule. Victory on the field of battle did not automatically translate to political control. England was a land of local loyalties, deeply ingrained Anglo-Saxon traditions, and a population loyal to the memory of Harold and previous rulers. To establish authority, William understood that swift action, both militarily and diplomatically, would be essential. William immediately ordered his surviving troops to maintain discipline in the surrounding areas. Unlike the chaotic aftermath of many medieval battles, where victorious armies often pillaged indiscriminately, William sought to assert control and limit disorder. Soldiers were commanded to secure strategic points, key towns, villages, and roads that connected southern England to the north and to the coast. By establishing garrisons at these locations, William could maintain supply lines, ensure rapid communication between forces, and prevent pockets of resistance from regrouping. This was a calculated approach. A chaotic or brutal occupation could have alienated the local population, sparking rebellions or resistance that might jeopardize his newly won crown. Simultaneously, William began the process of legitimizing his claim to the throne. The Pope had already sanctioned his invasion, granting him spiritual authority over England, but this needed to be reinforced in the eyes of the English nobility and clergy. William sent envoys to major churches, monasteries, and remaining English leaders, asserting that the invasion was divinely sanctioned and aimed at uniting England under a just and lawful ruler. Gifts, oaths of loyalty, and promises of protection for those willing to pledge fealty were extended. He understood that the English were not merely subjects. They were people steeped in centuries of traditions and legal customs. Legitimacy, not only fear, would secure lasting control. Across the countryside, villages began to hear the news of Harold's death and the Norman victory. Many towns were initially hesitant to respond, unsure whether the Normans represented safety, retribution, or occupation. William's measured approach allowed him to present himself not only as a conqueror, but as a king capable of governance. By stabilizing the south of England and moving swiftly to integrate administrative control, he ensured that resistance, while inevitable in some regions, could not coalesce into a unified rebellion immediately. In this way, William's military genius extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of statecraft, ensuring that the legacy of Hastings would endure not merely as a victory in battle, but as the foundation for the establishment of Norman England. Following the decisive victory at Hastings, William faced the daunting task of imposing Norman rule across a kingdom still loyal to its previous rulers. The transition was anything but immediate. Local lords, clergy, and communities had lived under Anglo-Saxon customs for generations, and sudden changes in governance were met with suspicion and resistance. To ensure control, William began a series of strategic and systematic measures designed to secure the crown and integrate the existing social and political order into Norman structures. William appointed trusted Norman nobles and knights to key positions across England, granting them land and titles while simultaneously displacing or subordinating Anglo-Saxon lords. Castles and fortifications were constructed at critical locations, serving both as military strongpoints and administrative centers. These structures not only allowed William to project power across the newly conquered territories, but also symbolized the permanence of Norman authority. The construction of these castles fundamentally altered the landscape of England, introducing new architectural styles, military techniques, and administrative centers that centralized control under Norman leadership. At the same time, William sought to win the allegiance of the English clergy. Churches, abbeys, and monasteries played a central role in medieval governance, and their support, or at least their neutrality, was crucial. William strategically replaced key bishops and abbots with loyal Normans, ensuring that the spiritual and administrative machinery of the church aligned with his rule. Simultaneously, he granted protections and privileges to those English clergy who accepted his authority, demonstrating a careful balance of reward and coercion designed to reduce immediate unrest while consolidating long-term influence. The local population faced profound changes. Norman soldiers, administrators, and settlers introduced new legal, linguistic, and cultural practices. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was diminished, their lands redistributed among Norman loyalists, which caused both resentment and fear. For peasants and villagers, daily life was disrupted by taxation, new obligations to Norman lords, and the presence of fortifications and garrisons. Despite this, William maintained enough stability in order to prevent widespread revolt in the immediate aftermath of conquest. His careful combination of military presence, administrative control, and political diplomacy created a foundation for what would become a lasting Norman monarchy in England. By the end of the first year of his rule, William had not only consolidated power in southern England, but had begun to extend influence into central and northern regions. Though pockets of resistance persisted, particularly in the north, the Norman Conquest had fundamentally reshaped the political and social order. William's ability to transition from battlefield victory to effective governance highlighted the dual nature of his genius. The same strategic mind that led him to triumph at Hastings now guided him in the delicate, complex task of ruling a foreign kingdom. The impact of the Norman Conquest extended far beyond the political and military spheres. Within years, the cultural, social, and linguistic fabric of England began to transform in ways that would endure for centuries. Norman influence permeated the aristocracy, the church, the legal system, and everyday life, creating a hybrid Anglo-Norman society that fundamentally altered the identity of the nation. One of the most immediate changes was linguistic. Norman French became the language of the court, the nobility, and legal documents. Anglo-Saxon English, while still spoken by the majority of the population, was increasingly marginalized in governance and elite society. Legal codes, property records, and royal decrees were written in Norman French, embedding the conqueror's language in the administration of the kingdom. Over time, the mingling of Old English and Norman French produced Middle English, a linguistic evolution that laid the foundation for the English language as we know it today. Words associated with law, governance, art, and refinement entered the vocabulary, enriching English with layers of Norman influence. Socially, the hierarchy of England was altered dramatically. Norman nobles replaced or overshadowed Anglo-Saxon lords, and land ownership was centralized under William's authority. The feudal system, already present in Normandy, was systematically imposed in England. Lords owed loyalty and military service to the king, while peasants became bound to their manors under new obligations. This redistribution of land and restructuring of society not only solidified William's control, but also created enduring social divisions and hierarchies that would persist for centuries. Architecturally, the Normans introduced stone castles, fortified keeps, and monumental churches that reshaped the English landscape. Motte and Bailey castles appeared across key regions, serving as defensive strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of Norman authority. Cathedrals and monasteries built in the Romanesque style reflected both spiritual dominance and the conqueror's desire to impress subjects with grandeur and permanence. These physical structures, visible across the land, reinforced Norman rule and created lasting markers of conquest and cultural transformation. Culturally, the fusion of Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions produced new forms of art, literature, law, and governance. While the conquerors imposed many of their customs, they also absorbed and adapted aspects of English culture. The result was a society that blended continuity with change, a New England shaped by conquest, but informed by the traditions of its people. Over time, this synthesis would produce enduring institutions, language, and legal practices that remain recognizable in modern English society. After securing the battlefield and asserting military dominance, William the Conqueror understood that controlling England required more than force. It demanded a total reorganization of administration. The Anglo-Saxon system had been functional, yet relied heavily on local lords, customary law, and regional loyalties. To prevent rebellion and maintain long-term authority, William initiated sweeping reforms that centralized governance, imposed loyalty, and established structures that would endure for centuries. One of William's first priorities was the redistribution of land. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had resisted him were dispossessed, their estates confiscated and granted to Norman lords who had supported the invasion. This redistribution served multiple purposes. It rewarded loyalty, created a new elite class beholden directly to the king, and fractured the old Anglo-Saxon networks of power that could foment rebellion. Large swaths of land in the south and east were now held by Normans, creating a hierarchical structure of vassalage where each lord owed military service and allegiance to the crown. This process extended to ecclesiastical holdings as well. Key abbeys, monasteries, and church lands were reassigned to Norman bishops who would align religious authority with royal power. Alongside land redistribution, William implemented a systematic taxation and administrative framework. Officials, known as sheriffs, were installed across shires to collect taxes, maintain order, and enforce the king's law. This centralized authority was unprecedented in England. Sheriffs reported directly to William, bypassing traditional local structures that had been loyal to the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. The implementation of standardized measurements, consistent taxation systems, and formalized records allowed the crown to exert far greater control over resources, creating a hierarchical structure of vassalage where each lord owed military service and allegiance to the crown. This process extended to ecclesiastical holdings as well. Key abbeys, monasteries, and church lands were reassigned to Norman bishops who would align religious authority with royal power. Alongside land redistribution, William implemented a systematic taxation and administrative framework. Officials, known as sheriffs, were installed across shires to collect taxes, maintain order, and enforce the king's law. This centralized authority was unprecedented in England. Sheriffs reported directly to William, bypassing traditional local structures that had been loyal to the Anglo-Saxon monarchy. The implementation of standardized measurements, consistent taxation systems, and formalized records allowed the crown to exert far greater control over resources, population, and military levies than previous rulers have been able to achieve. The Domesday Book, compiled later in 1086, would become the culmination of this administrative revolution, cataloging the wealth, landholdings, and resources of the entire kingdom. The introduction of Norman legal practices further strengthened the central authority. Customary Anglo-Saxon law persisted in many local matters, yet Norman legal principles were imposed at higher levels, particularly in matters of property, inheritance, and feudal obligations. Courts were reorganized to reflect royal oversight, ensuring that disputes could be adjudicated in alignment with Norman governance rather than local tradition. This careful balance of continuity and reform prevented immediate unrest while embedding a new legal culture that strengthened William's rule. In essence, England was transformed from a loosely connected patchwork of local allegiances into a kingdom structured around a centralized, hierarchical authority capable of projecting power across its territory. While administration secured loyalty and resources, William understood that military dominance required a permanent presence to prevent rebellion and enforce authority. Thus began the monumental construction of castles across England, reshaping the landscape both physically and politically. The motte and bailey design, imported from Normandy, provided a combination of defense, oversight, and psychological intimidation. Elevated mottes allowed watchful observation of surrounding lands, while enclosed baileys offered fortified housing for soldiers, stables, and essential supplies. Each castle served not only as a defensive bastion, but as a statement. Norman rule was permanent, structured, and unchallengeable. The strategic placement of these castles was no accident. Key towns, trade routes, river crossings, and historically rebellious regions were prioritized. By controlling these points, William could rapidly deploy forces, suppress uprisings, and protect economic and political centers. Castles became nodes of authority, linking military presence with administrative oversight. Norman lords stationed within them acted both as governors and enforcers, ensuring compliance with royal mandates and demonstrating the crown's reach. Even distant villages felt the presence of this network, influencing behavior and allegiance. These fortifications also had a profound psychological impact. For the Anglo-Saxon population, castles represented the permanence and inevitability of Norman dominance. They were reminders of the conquest, a daily visual reinforcement of a new social hierarchy, and a deterrent against rebellion. Soldiers stationed in these fortresses provided security, enforced taxation, and maintained order, reducing the likelihood that displaced or resentful Anglo-Saxon lords could organize resistance. The castle network, coupled with administrative oversight, created a dual structure of control, civil authority backed by immediate military capability. Beyond their functional and symbolic purposes, the castles contributed to cultural change. Norman architectural styles, including stone keeps and Romanesque design, introduced new techniques and aesthetics that influenced future English architecture. Monasteries, churches, and town fortifications incorporated Norman elements, merging local tradition with imported innovation. The castles also stimulated local economies, as their construction required labor, materials, and logistics, providing work for peasants while further integrating Norman influence into English society. In short, the castle network was both a tool of control and a transformative force in the development of post-conquest England. The imposition of Norman social structures marked another fundamental shift in England's political landscape. With the redistribution of land, the creation of castles, and the establishment of a centralized bureaucracy, the king and his loyal nobles now dominated society through a complex web of feudal obligations. Feudalism, already present in Normandy, became the organizing principle of English life. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service, loyalty, and tribute, establishing a hierarchical network that connected peasants, knights, barons, and the king himself in a chain of mutual obligation. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, largely displaced or subordinated, saw their influence decline. Some were allowed to retain minor holdings, provided they pledged allegiance to William, while others were removed entirely, their estates granted to Norman lords. This disruption created resentment and occasional uprisings, particularly in northern England, but it effectively prevented the reconstitution of the old power structures that might challenge the crown. Over time, the new nobility became fully integrated into Norman English society, enforcing law, taxation, and military service, while their economic and political influence cemented the Norman monarchy's power. At the local level, peasants faced new obligations. They were required to work on the lord's land, pay rents or taxes, and provide services in kind. While these duties mirrored certain pre-conquest practices, the enforcement and legal codification of obligations under Norman rule introduced a more rigid structure. Villagers were increasingly subject to the authority of lords who represented royal power directly, reducing local autonomy and embedding the feudal hierarchy in everyday life. Social mobility, while limited, became tied directly to military service or loyalty to a Norman lord, further entwining personal fate with a new political order. Culturally, these changes were profound. Norman influence permeated law, language, and courtly customs. French became the language of administration, nobility, and the court, blending gradually with Old English to form Middle English. Legal norms, land tenure systems, and social etiquette were redefined, integrating Norman practices with existing traditions. Over decades, these shifts created a hybrid society that, while rooted in conquest, evolved into a uniquely English identity. The Norman Conquest was not merely a military victory. It was a transformative event that restructured governance, society, and culture, laying the foundations for a new England under William's enduring rule. By the late 1080s, William the Conqueror had consolidated military control over England, constructed an extensive network of castles, and imposed Norman governance on a society still adapting to foreign rule. Yet despite these achievements, he faced a persistent challenge: understanding the wealth, resources, and obligations of his kingdom. England was a patchwork of counties, manors, and lands, each with different levels of productivity, populations, and loyalty. To govern effectively, levy taxes, and ensure military readiness, William required precise knowledge of what resources were available, who controlled them, and what obligations could be enforced. This need led to one of the most remarkable administrative achievements of medieval Europe, the Domesday Survey. The Domesday Book, commissioned in 1085 and completed in 1086, was essentially a comprehensive record of England's landholdings and resources. Its purpose was multifaceted. First, it allowed the crown to assess taxes accurately, ensuring that all income due to the king could be collected efficiently. Second, it provided a detailed inventory of land ownership, allowing William to monitor compliance with feudal obligations and prevent disputes between his vassals. Finally, it acted as a strategic tool. By understanding the economic and demographic landscape, William could determine the military potential of each region, allocate resources effectively, and preemptively identify areas of possible rebellion. The survey was unprecedented in scope and methodology. Royal commissioners traveled across England, questioning local lords, reeves, and villagers, recording data on land, livestock, plow teams, mills, fisheries, and other resources. They cataloged who held the land during Edward the Confessor's reign, who held it in 1086, and the value of the property for tax purposes. The level of detail was extraordinary for the period, capturing not only economic data, but also social and administrative structures. This meticulous documentation reflected William's understanding that effective governance required empirical knowledge, a principle far ahead of its time. Moreover, the Domesday Book served a symbolic purpose. Its compilation asserted the ultimate authority of the Norman crown over England, demonstrating that no land or resources could escape royal scrutiny. By recording every manor, village, and taxable asset, William emphasized the centralization of power, reinforcing the feudal hierarchy he had established. The survey created transparency in administration while consolidating the perception of William as a ruler with unparalleled control. The resulting Domesday Book was not merely a record. It was a tool of governance, taxation, and social engineering, embedding Norman authority into the very fabric of England. The execution of the Domesday Survey required careful planning and coordination. Commissioners, often men of high administrative competence, were dispatched to counties across England, accompanied by scribes and local officials. Their mission was to gather accurate information, often facing challenges such as local resistance, incomplete records, and the complexities of varied land tenure systems. Despite these obstacles, the surveyors employed a systematic approach. They cataloged each manor, assessed its size and productivity, and noted the obligations of tenants, whether Anglo-Saxon or Norman. The commissioners recorded not only the quantity of land and resources, but also the people who lived on it. Villagers, peasants, and serfs were accounted for according to their labor obligations, rights, and social status. Livestock counts, agricultural output, and the presence of mills, fisheries, and other assets were meticulously documented. Each entry identified who had held the property during Edward the Confessor's reign, who held it at the time of the survey, and its taxable value. This comprehensive accounting allowed William to enforce his control with precision, ensuring that neither tax avoidance nor feudal disloyalty could undermine the crown's authority. Execution of the survey also required a delicate balance of enforcement and negotiation. Local Anglo-Saxon lords, who had survived the conquest, were often reluctant to cooperate fully. Commissioners relied on both persuasion and the implicit threat of royal retribution to ensure accurate reporting. Failure to provide truthful information could result in confiscation of property, fines, or other penalties. This blend of administrative authority and strategic intimidation ensured compliance while reinforcing the perception of William's omnipotent oversight. Once data was collected, it was compiled into what became the Domesday Book, organized by shires and hundreds, providing a structured and highly detailed reference. The book's systematic organization enabled the Crown to cross-reference information, detect inconsistencies, and maintain an enduring record for governance. In many ways, the Domesday Survey represented the culmination of William's vision for a controlled, efficient, and centralized kingdom. It transformed England from a fragmented, locally administered land into a kingdom whose resources, obligations, and potential could be managed from the royal court with unprecedented authority. The completion of the Domesday Book had profound economic and political consequences for England. Economically, it allowed the Crown to enforce taxation systematically, ensuring that every manor and tenant contributed to the royal treasury. Taxes collected were not only used for the maintenance of the monarchy and military, but also for the construction of infrastructure, fortifications, and public works. The precision of the survey enabled William to exploit the full economic potential of his kingdom, stabilizing royal finances and creating a predictable revenue stream that could support both domestic governance and foreign ambitions. Politically, the Domesday Survey reinforced Norman dominance over the Anglo-Saxon population. By meticulously recording landholdings and obligations, William could monitor compliance, identify disloyal lords, and respond swiftly to potential rebellions. The redistribution of land recorded in the survey reinforced feudal hierarchies and cemented the new elite class of Norman nobles, creating a power structure that was directly accountable to the king. For Anglo-Saxon survivors, the book symbolized the permanence of Norman rule. It demonstrated that every acre of land, every resource, and every obligation fell under William's scrutiny. Socially, the survey reshaped relationships between lords, vassals, and peasants. Peasants and villagers, who were now recorded in official documents, faced formalized obligations that reinforced feudal norms. Lords could no longer rely solely on traditional local authority. Their power was regulated through legal and administrative frameworks backed by the crown. The Domesday Book effectively codified the social and economic hierarchy that had been emerging since the conquest, embedding it within the administrative apparatus of the kingdom. As both conqueror and ruler, the Domesday Book symbolized the transformation of England under Norman rule, marking this survey's influence extended far beyond immediate governance. It became a historical record, providing future generations with an unprecedented snapshot of 11th century England. Scholars, historians, and administrators have used it to understand land tenure, population, economy, and governance for centuries. In William's time, however, it was a tool of control, an instrument of strategic dominance, and a testament to his vision. He transitioned from a fragmented Anglo-Saxon realm into a highly organized, centralized monarchy capable of projecting authority across the entire kingdom. Despite William's meticulous consolidation in the south, control over northern England proved far more challenging. The north had historically been distant from the centers of Anglo-Saxon power in Wessex and Mercia, and its population retained strong ties to local traditions, regional lords, and ecclesiastical authorities. The imposition of Norman authority, redistribution of land, and the presence of garrisons provoked resentment. Anglo-Saxon nobles who had survived the initial conquest viewed the Normans as foreign occupiers, and the peasantry was burdened with new obligations that disrupted long-standing social patterns. It was only a matter of time before this tension erupted into organized rebellion. By the late 1060s, reports of unrest began to reach William's court. Rebellious activities included attacks on Norman garrisons, refusal to pay taxes, and local uprisings led by surviving Anglo-Saxon nobles and local chieftains. These revolts, while fragmented, demonstrated the continued loyalty of northern populations to the memory of Harold and the Anglo-Saxon dynasty. In particular, regions such as Northumbria and Yorkshire became hotbeds of resistance, where local leaders marshaled both manpower and knowledge of the terrain to challenge Norman authority. Guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and attacks on communication lines disrupted Norman control and forced the crown to respond with both military force and political negotiation. William's initial response was calculated, rather than relying solely on brute force. He deployed a combination of punitive expeditions and strategic concessions. His forces moved quickly into rebellious areas, overwhelming resistance through superior numbers, siege warfare, and disciplined military organization. Castles were constructed in key northern locations to serve as both fortifications and administrative centers, reinforcing Norman presence and deterring further insurrection. These actions were supplemented by the appointment of loyal Norman lords to replace rebellious Anglo-Saxon leaders, consolidating both military and administrative authority. The northern rebellions highlighted the challenges inherent in governing a newly conquered, culturally distinct region. While William had secured victory in battle and imposed governance in the south, the north's distance, rugged terrain, and entrenched local loyalties meant that the conquest was far from complete. The resistance demonstrated that military victory alone could not fully integrate England under Norman rule. It required a combination of strategic suppression, administrative oversight, and cultural assimilation. The stage was set for William's most notorious campaign in the north, a campaign that would leave an indelible mark on English history and profoundly reshape the landscape, population, and political dynamics of the region. By 1069, the northern resistance reached a critical point. A coalition of Anglo-Saxon rebels, possibly aided by Danish forces seeking to reclaim influence in England, attacked Norman garrisons and settlements, threatening the fragile stability William had established. Recognizing the need for decisive action, William launched a campaign known as the Harrying of the North, a brutal effort to crush rebellion and secure permanent control over the region. This campaign would become infamous for its severity, demonstrating William's resolve to maintain authority and reshape the socio-political landscape. The Harrying of the North involved systematic devastation of the countryside. Norman forces burned villages, destroyed crops, slaughtered livestock, and demolished homes. This scorched earth strategy left large areas depopulated and economically crippled, preventing rebel forces from finding food, shelter, or resources for sustained resistance. Entire regions, from York to the surrounding countryside, suffered the consequences of the campaign as famine, disease, and displacement followed the destruction. Contemporary chronicles report widespread suffering, with survivors struggling to rebuild their communities in the aftermath of the devastation. William's strategy, while ruthless, achieved its objectives. Resistance was effectively suppressed, and Norman authority in northern England became unchallenged for decades. The harrying of the North sent a clear message to other regions and potential rebels. Defiance against the crown would be met with uncompromising retaliation. At the same time, the campaign allowed William to consolidate administrative and military control in an area historically difficult to govern. Castles and garrisons were reinforced, loyal Norman lords were installed, and communication between northern and southern England was improved, reducing the likelihood of coordinated rebellion in the future. The campaign also had long-term social consequences. Populations in affected areas were significantly reduced, with survivors often relocated or integrated into new feudal arrangements under Norman lords. Traditional Anglo-Saxon leaders were eliminated or subordinated, further weakening the old social hierarchy. Economically, recovery was slow, and the landscape bore the scars of destruction for years. The harrying of the North, while securing immediate control, represented the darker side of conquest, a willingness to impose dominance through fear, strategic brutality, and the reshaping of society to align with the ruler's authority. Following the suppression of northern revolts, William turned his attention to the broader task of integrating England into a cohesive, stable kingdom. With the South relatively secure, northern England devastated and pacified, and the feudal hierarchy firmly in place, the focus shifted toward long-term governance, legal standardization, and cultural consolidation. William recognized that enduring stability required more than military dominance. It necessitated administrative cohesion, economic productivity, and a sense of order that extended across the entire kingdom. One of William's key strategies was the continued construction of castles and fortifications, particularly along strategic northern corridors. These structures not only provided military security, but also served as centers of administration, collection, and surveillance. Norman lords stationed in these fortresses acted as extensions of royal authority, ensuring that policies were implemented, taxes collected, and potential uprisings suppressed before they could coalesce. By combining military presence with bureaucratic oversight, William created a system in which authority was both visible and enforceable, reducing the risk of rebellion and promoting compliance across disparate regions. The legal system was also refined to support Norman rule. While local Anglo-Saxon customs persisted in matters of daily life, royal courts and officials were empowered to enforce feudal obligations, property disputes, and criminal law in alignment with Norman principles. The integration of these legal practices reinforced social hierarchies, validated land transfers, and ensured that loyalty to the crown was central to political life. This blending of Norman law with local tradition created a hybrid legal framework capable of governing a culturally diverse kingdom. Culturally, William's policies encouraged assimilation while asserting Norman dominance. The Anglo-Saxon elite, though marginalized, gradually adapted to Norman rule through marriage, loyalty oaths, and participation in the new feudal system. Language, architecture, and administrative practices were increasingly influenced by Norman customs, producing a transformed English society. Education, ecclesiastical patronage, and governance became conduits for cultural transmission, ensuring that the influence of the Normans extended beyond mere conquest to shape the identity of England itself. By the end of William's reign, the foundations of a unified, centralized, and culturally integrated kingdom were firmly established, illustrating the profound and lasting impact of the Norman Conquest on every aspect of English life. A critical aspect of William's consolidation of England was the reform and reorganization of the church, which held immense social, economic, and political power. The Anglo-Saxon Church, though deeply rooted in English society, had been closely aligned with the previous monarchy. Bishops and abbots often came from local noble families and wielded influence across both spiritual and temporal matters. To secure his rule and prevent the church from becoming a focal point of resistance, William systematically replaced Anglo-Saxon clergy with loyal Normans, ensuring that religious authority was aligned with the crown. William's approach was multifaceted. Key bishoprics, including Canterbury and York, were given to Norman clerics with strong ties to both the king and the papacy. Monasteries, abbeys, and cathedral chapters were similarly reorganized, with Norman abbots and priors replacing Anglo-Saxon leaders. This allowed William to integrate ecclesiastical administration into his broader system of governance. The church became an extension of royal authority, enforcing loyalty, promoting the king's legitimacy, and facilitating communication across the kingdom. Clergy now owed allegiance directly to the crown, creating a dual hierarchy of spiritual and political influence that reinforced Norman control. In addition to personnel changes, William introduced structural reforms to the church. Norman architectural styles reshaped ecclesiastical buildings, emphasizing Romanesque grandeur and permanence. Monasteries were reorganized to follow Norman monastic rules, standardizing religious life and practices across England. Wealth and landholdings of the church were carefully monitored to ensure that they contributed to the crown's authority, whether through taxation, military service, or administrative cooperation. The integration of religious institutions into the Norman governance system strengthened both the moral and practical legitimacy of William's rule, while also promoting cultural assimilation through architectural, linguistic, and administrative influence. By controlling the church, William also strengthened his connection to the wider European Christian world. Papal support had justified the invasion, and aligning the English clergy with Norman interests reinforced these diplomatic and religious bonds. The church became a crucial intermediary, educating the population, enforcing laws, and supporting cultural transformation. In doing so, William ensured that the conquest was not merely military, but spiritual and administrative, creating a society in which loyalty to the king was reinforced at every level of life, from village parishioners to powerful abbots and bishops. This alignment of church and crown proved indispensable in maintaining control over a diverse and recently conquered population. Beyond personnel and administrative changes, William prioritized monastic reform as a tool to influence both religion and education. Monasteries were not only centers of worship, but hubs of literacy, learning, and social organization. Anglo-Saxon monasteries had followed traditions that varied regionally, often emphasizing local saints, customs, and governance. By introducing Norman monastic rules, William ensured that religious institutions followed standardized practices, strengthening central control and embedding Norman cultural norms. The Benedictine order, already influential in Normandy, became the model for English monasteries. Reform included stricter adherence to communal life, liturgical consistency, and centralized oversight by Norman abbots. This standardization increased the influence of the church while ensuring that monasteries served both spiritual and administrative functions. Monastic scribes were employed to produce documents for both ecclesiastical and secular purposes, contributing to the meticulous record-keeping that characterized Norman governance, including preparations for surveys like the Domesday Book. Education became intertwined with these reforms. Monasteries were primary centers of literacy and learning, training clergy and administrators capable of sustaining Norman rule. Latin, as the language of administration and scholarship, was reinforced through these institutions, creating a literate elite capable of managing the kingdom's legal economic, and ecclesiastical matters. Anglo-Saxon cultural practices were gradually integrated or replaced with Norman ones, shaping the intellectual and spiritual life of England. This focus on monastic reform and education ensured the longevity of William's rule, embedding a network of trained personnel who could support both the crown and the church in governance, diplomacy, and religious life. The combination of religious reform and education allowed William to exert influence over the hearts and minds of the population. Villagers and peasants, through daily contact with parish clergy and monastery-led initiatives, experienced the norms and practices promoted by the Norman Church. This slow but steady cultural integration reinforced the legitimacy of Norman authority and reduced the likelihood of rebellion rooted in religious loyalty to the former Anglo-Saxon hierarchy. William's strategic use of religious institutions was thus both practical and symbolic, consolidating power while reshaping England's spiritual and cultural landscape. William's influence extended beyond administration and personnel to the very architecture and aesthetics of the English Church. Norman ecclesiastical architecture transformed the skyline of towns, cities, and rural regions, signaling both power and permanence. Stone churches, abbeys, and cathedrals replaced or supplemented older wooden structures, reflecting Romanesque style with rounded arches, massive walls, and decorative ornamentation. These architectural achievements were not merely symbolic. They demonstrated the technical skill, resources, and organizational capacity of Norman society, while physically embedding Norman cultural identity in the English landscape. Cathedrals, in particular, became focal points of regional authority. Canterbury, York, Winchester, and other prominent cities were centers not only of worship, but also of political, economic, and social activity. The presence of Norman bishops and abbots, combined with the grandeur of the buildings themselves, reinforced the centrality of Norman power. Pilgrimages, religious ceremonies, and festivals attracted people from across regions, spreading both faith and cultural norms. Architecture became a means of communication, conveying authority, sophistication, and permanence to populations that had previously been governed through local traditions. The construction of religious buildings also stimulated local economies and labor systems. Stone, timber, and other materials had to be sourced, craftsmen and masons trained or imported, and labor organized on a scale previously uncommon in Anglo-Saxon England. These projects created jobs, encouraged innovation, and facilitated the integration of Norman administrative and logistical methods into local society. Additionally, monasteries and churches often acted as centers of charity, education, and local governance, further intertwining religious institutions with daily life and reinforcing loyalty to the new regime. Culturally, the introduction of Norman religious architecture and practices created a visual and experiential representation of conquest and assimilation. The population could see, hear, and participate in the transformation of society, from liturgy to building style, from law to daily obligations. Through the church, William's influence penetrated every layer of society, ensuring that the conquest was not only remembered as a military victory, but internalized as a new social, cultural, and spiritual order. In this way, the alignment of church and crown was a cornerstone of the enduring success of Norman rule, embedding both authority and identity within the very structures and practices of England. The Norman Conquest fundamentally transformed the political landscape of England, establishing a new dynasty and redefining the monarchy itself. With the death of Harold Godwinson at Hastings in 1066 and William's victory, the Anglo-Saxon line of kings was extinguished, replaced by the Normans who would rule for generations. William, as the first Norman king of England, centralized power in a way that had never been seen under Anglo-Saxon rule. The crown no longer relied solely on regional loyalties or the negotiation of local power networks. Instead, authority flowed from the king to a newly created Norman aristocracy whose position depended entirely on fealty to the monarch. This redistribution of power ensured the long-term stability of Norman rule. William granted vast estates to his loyal followers, creating a feudal hierarchy that intertwined military service, loyalty, and land ownership. The traditional Anglo-Saxon nobility was largely removed from positions of influence, with only a few minor figures allowed to retain holdings under strict conditions. This restructuring prevented the resurgence of native dynastic power and established a system in which Norman authority was reinforced by both land and military obligation. Feudalism became the organizing principle of governance, embedding loyalty and hierarchy into the structure of the kingdom. The establishment of a centralized monarchy under William also had important dynastic consequences. Norman rulers married strategically, forming alliances with French, Italian, and other European nobility, which strengthened England's position on the continent and extended the political influence of the crown. Succession laws were formalized, often guided by Norman customs, creating a continuity of rule that reduced the likelihood of internal disputes. By consolidating power, creating a loyal aristocracy, and establishing clear dynastic structures, William ensured that the Norman monarchy would endure well beyond his own reign, transforming England into a kingdom capable of projecting authority both internally and across Europe. The conquest's impact was not limited to politics. It also profoundly reshaped English culture, language, and law. The introduction of Norman French as the language of the court, administration, and elite society transformed the linguistic landscape of England. Legal terminology, official documents, and court proceedings were conducted in French, blending with the native Anglo-Saxon language to eventually produce Middle English. This linguistic fusion enriched English vocabulary, particularly in areas of law, governance, art, and aristocratic life, leaving a lasting legacy on the language as we know it today. Cultural assimilation extended beyond language. Norman architectural styles dominated both secular and religious structures. Castles, fortifications, and cathedrals transformed the physical landscape, introducing Romanesque features such as massive stone walls, rounded arches, and decorative motifs. These constructions not only demonstrated the technical sophistication of the Normans, but also served as enduring symbols of conquest and authority. The integration of Norman art, design, and monastic practices into English society created a new cultural synthesis, combining Anglo-Saxon traditions with continental innovation. Over time, this blending shaped literature, art, and intellectual life across the kingdom. Legally, the Normans introduced reforms that would endure for centuries. Feudal obligations became codified, the roles of sheriffs and royal courts were formalized, and land tenure was systematically recorded, culminating in documents like the Domesday Book. Anglo-Saxon customary law was gradually integrated with Norman practices, producing a hybrid legal system that provided greater consistency, centralized oversight, and enforceable authority. These changes enhanced royal power, standardized administration, and ensured that governance could operate efficiently across a geographically and culturally diverse kingdom. In every sense, the Norman Conquest was as much a transformation of law, language, and culture as it was a military triumph. The Norman Conquest legacy extended far beyond William's reign, influencing England politically, socially, culturally, and economically for centuries. By establishing a centralized monarchy backed by feudal loyalty, William created a stable system of governance capable of maintaining authority over a previously fragmented and localized society. The redistribution of land and creation of Norman aristocracy ensured a long-term hierarchy that reinforced royal control, while the integration of military, administrative, and religious structures provided cohesion across the kingdom. Economically, the conquest transformed land management, taxation, and resource allocation. The Domesday Book recorded and standardized landholdings and wealth, enabling efficient taxation and fiscal oversight. Norman methods of managing estates, agriculture, and resources introduced new productivity techniques and hierarchical control over labor, reshaping rural life. Castles, roads, and fortifications also facilitated trade, communication, and military logistics, further strengthening economic integration. The kingdom became not only politically centralized, but economically coherent, capable of sustaining both internal administration and external ventures, including campaigns on the European continent. Culturally and socially, the Norman Conquest reshaped English identity. French language and customs merged with Anglo-Saxon traditions, producing Middle English, influencing literature, law, education, and religious practices. Norman architectural and artistic styles became standard, while feudal social hierarchies structured daily life. The church, reorganized and aligned with the crown, reinforced both spiritual and political loyalty. Over centuries, this integration produced a unique Anglo-Norman culture that was neither wholly Norman nor entirely Anglo-Saxon, but a synthesis that became distinctly English. The conquest also established England as a major player in European politics, tying it to the Norman aristocracy and continental affairs. Ultimately, the Norman Conquest of 1066 reshaped the course of English history. Military victory at Hastings was the catalyst, but the careful consolidation of power, administrative innovation, religious reform, and cultural integration ensured enduring change. England emerged from the conquest transformed, centralized, hierarchical, and increasingly integrated with continental Europe. William the Conqueror's vision extended beyond battlefield triumph. It created a kingdom capable of projecting authority, fostering economic growth, and sustaining cultural development. The legacy of 1066 resonates to this day, shaping the language, laws, social structure, and identity of England's centuries after the fall of Harold Godwinson and the rise of Norman rule. And that concludes our deep dive into the Norman Conquest of 1066, right here on History Teller YT. Today, we've traveled across battlefields, through the chaos of invasion, and into the heart of a kingdom transformed. We've witnessed the bravery of Harold, the calculated genius of William, and the monumental changes that reshaped politics, culture, language, and law in England forever. The moral of this history is clear. Victory on the battlefield is only the beginning. True conquest comes from strategy, governance, and the ability to reshape society to endure beyond your lifetime. The Norman Conquest teaches us that history is not just about battles. It's about vision, resilience, and the legacies we leave behind. If you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss an epic story from History Teller YT. Comment below which part of the Norman Conquest surprised you the most, and share this story with fellow history enthusiasts. We have countless more stories waiting. More empires, revolutions, battles, and extraordinary figures ready to be uncovered. So, until next time, keep your curiosity alive, and we'll see you again on History Teller YT, where the past always speaks and history comes alive.